Chapter 1, Motherless. Chapter text. Hello there. /n. This story is an AU and does not follow the canon events from the movies and TV series, so don't be surprised to see things happening differently from what you know. Also, the dragons are super smart and can talk telepathically, so please don't have a fit when they start talking. Tongue-poking smiley. Before the Dragons. Book 1 of the How to Light Up the Night series. Preface. Once upon a time, in a frigid land filled with enemies, there lived two young couples that were very similar in temperament but vastly different in species. In one case, we have two dragons entrapped by an evil queen. And in the other, we have two humans that didn't quite fit the norm. One admittedly a lot more than the other. These couples were astonishingly smart, strong, and sometimes just very lucky. Is it any wonder that stories are still told to this day about their epic adventures filled with romance, danger, and unbreakable bonds that somehow changed the world as they knew it? Some of the tales told about them seem quite unbelievable now, but after years of research, this author has pieced together the following story that, by all accounts, is as real as the stars in the sky. And it goes like this. Motherless. As shouts and dragon roars filled the air outside their home, Alga Horferson cradled her 1-month-old baby to her chest as she watched her husband of 3 years run around their bedroom while he tugged on armor and gathered up his weapons. "Be careful out there, Hector," she said with a hint of worry in her voice even as she ogled his backside while he bent over to scoop up his horned helmet. "The dragons are becoming more daring with every raid. I would hate to lose you. And that very fine ass." Hector paused in his preparations long enough to smile at his beautiful, slender, golden-haired wife. He balanced her determined chin on a long, calloused finger as he brushed a kiss over her mouth, and then placed another on the pale blonde fluff on top of baby Astrid's head. "I'll be fine, sweetheart. And just think, next time the dragons come, you get to have all the fun while I look after the little one." Alga smiled in anticipation as she gave Hector a playful punch to his thickly muscled arm. "Right. You know I'm holding you to that." The Viking man laughed as he strode out of their room and towards the outer door. "I wouldn't dare do anything else, my fierce wife. I like my equipment in functioning order." Alga smirked as she followed her brawny husband, a man handsome enough to make her sigh in happy bliss whenever he wasn't paying attention. "Couldn't ruin the tough girl image, you know. I like your equipment in working order, too, babe. Very, very much." Hector turned back with a hand on the now open door, winking a sky blue eye at her. "We can give it another test run when I get back, sweetness." The woman snorted and pushed him out the door. "Maybe if you take out a deadly nada, I might be sufficiently impressed," she teased with a gleam of anticipation in her royal blue eyes. "Then I'll be sure to do just that," he called over his shoulder as he plunked his helmet over his long, multi-braided, white blonde hair. Alga sighed softly as she watched his broad-shouldered form meld into the dark night interspersed with dragon flames and flakes of snow, hugging her happily gurgling daughter just a fraction closer to her chest. "Thor, please protect him. You know how much I love him." Only moments later, another, even broader, figure emerged from the dark, running up to her house with a baby tucked face down under his arm like a ball and his battle axe gripped in his other hand. Gods almighty, Valka has got to have a talk with her husband about how to hold a child. It's a wonder he hasn't dropped him yet. Alga. "Thank Thor Stoic the Vast, chieftain of their tribe," said as he thrust the small baby at her. "Here. Take care of the wee hiccup for me, would you? I don't know how I let Valka talk me into watching the youngling when there are dragons to fight." Alga snuggled the auburn-haired male baby that was no bigger than her own girl, despite being a couple months older, against her chest as well, laughing to herself as the clearly agitated man stormed into the fray without even waiting to see if Alga was open to the idea of taking care of two drooling and cooing babies. She looked down at the pair, who were now staring at each other in apparent fascination, and smiled lovingly at them. "At least you two get along." With one last longing glance at the, literally, heated battle taking place in the village of Berk, Alga reluctantly stepped back into the house and closed the door. The Viking woman known as Valka had carried a sword and was armored from head to toe, but actually fighting the dragons was never her intention. Instead, while in the guise of defending her village, she was actually looking for evidence of her theory that the dragons didn't actually intend them harm, but were just looking for food. She winced as another hut went up in flames with the help of a two-headed dragon called a hideous Zipleback. That isn't helping. Begone, you filthy beast. Those are my sheep. Ears figuratively perking at the roar of outrage from nearby, Valka ran down the wooden platform masquerading as a street, then climbed the stairs up to the next level of the cliffside village. She skidded to a stop when she saw the massive brown Storacutter dragon hovering over Hairyhanda's small flock of sheep. Despite her unwillingness to hurt such a magnificent dragon, she knew the sheep were important to the survival of the people of Berk, so she charged forward with her sword raised high and screamed out a Viking cry at the beast, hoping to scare it off. Its head swiveled around on its neck to look at her as the four massive wings flapped in the air, creating a current that made it hard for Valka to move forward against. Is all that flapping really necessary? She set her shoulders and pushed forward anyway, eyebrows rising in surprise when she saw the dragon rolled its eyes at her in a mocking fashion. She'd almost made it to the admittedly sketchy-looking fence holding the sheep in when her fearless husband leapt from a higher level of the mountainside village right onto the back of the dragon. Stoic. The Storacutter roared in fury, spewing flames from its wide mouth as Stoic raised his massive battle axe to strike the dragon. Valka froze and then dropped to the ground as the dragon spun and more flames shot over her head. She looked up in time to see Stoic go flying through the air and then land near the sheep in a graceful roll, startling the usually placid beasties into a chorus of baa-ass. A dragon flapping overhead wasn't worth their notice anymore, but a rolling Viking was something altogether different. She could only watch as her fearless husband jumped back onto his feet and charged at the dragon again with an impressive war cry. Gods, Stoic, don't get yourself killed. Man and dragon danced through the night, flames spewing everywhere and Stoic dodging, leaping, and rolling as he continued his determined attack on the dragon with his battle axe flashing reflected firelight. Magnificent. They are both absolutely magnificent. A loud crack behind her caught her attention. Valka turned just in time to see the house she'd been standing near crack again as dragon flames ate through the supporting beams in an alarmingly speedy fashion. Shite. Valka. Move, rang through the air even as she was already running the first step away from death. She was a little too preoccupied with not dying to notice that Stoic's yell had a bit of an echo inside her mind. A massive brown body suddenly appeared above her just as the house tumbled over in a cacophony of falling timber. Large claws wrapped around her shoulders and dug into her armor but didn't go past her layers of fur and tunics. Valka was carried up into the air, heart in her throat and breath frozen in fear. Oh, gods. This can't be happening. Valka. Stoic yelled from below. She looked down and saw him sprinting after her and her captor. Stoic. Valka called back, hand reaching for him beseechingly despite already being higher than he could possibly reach. In a last-ditch attempt to stop the dragon from stealing his wife, Stoic threw his battle axe as hard as he could, aiming for a wing. Valka heard the Storacutter roar as the axe struck true before being dislodged with the next flap of its mighty wings. She gasped as its flight faltered in the air for a moment before it determinedly flew on, ignoring the tear in the skin of its wing. She strained her neck around as best as she could for one last glimpse of her husband as he was forced to stop at the edge of a cliff. Valka tore through the night sky one more time as he fell to his knees. Tears fell from her eyes. Stoic, she whimpered. Hiccup. Take care of our baby, she implored the air, hoping her husband heard her heart's last wish as she was flown to what she assumed was her doom. The Storacutter bent its head down and looked at her curiously, no malice in its eyes anymore. Please. Take me back, she begged the dragon. No, came back a very clear deep male voice in her mind. Valka stopped breathing in shock. What did you say? She managed to wheeze out of empty lungs after a minute. I said no, the dragon thought to her once more before he blinked once and looked up again at where he was going. He continued on his journey to some unknown location through the winter clouds, heedless of her cries to take her back or at least explain himself. After an hour, she gave up and just processed the fact that dragons, or at least this dragon, had the ability to mind speak. Valka was flabbergasted to say the least. It raised so many questions and made the war with the dragons seem even more wrong to her. If dragons were intelligent beings and not just animals, then humans had no business slaughtering them hither and yon, defending their livestock or not. Stoic lost the will to move for the better part of an hour, just staring off into the distance where the dragon and his beloved wife had disappeared into. His cries of, "Valka!" had all become internal after he'd lost sight of them, and they sounded increasingly pathetic even in his own mind, but he couldn't seem to stop. His heart felt like it had shattered into a million pieces and it hurt to breath as if those pieces were stabbing him from within. By the time he worked up the energy to move, he was near frozen and covered in snow, but he hardly noticed, the cold in his soul so much greater than what his body was feeling. With one last, "Valka," he trudged back into the village, barely noticing that the battle was over and people were putting out the last few sputters of flames. Out of habit, his feet walked to his home at the top of the village, every step feeling just as arduous as the last. He walked into the living area and stopped, staring at the hearth that had a cauldron of fragrant-smelling stew bubbling away in it. His appetite for dinner was long gone, and the smell made him faintly nauseous, so he swept his eyes elsewhere. They landed on the cradle in the corner beside the table and he suddenly straightened. Hiccup. My son. I still have my son. Suddenly rejuvenated, Stoic spun on his heel and he bolted back down the pathways towards the Horferson house. About halfway there, his best friend, Gobber, caught up to him, holding Stoic's battle axe, and pulling him to a stop by the tunic. Stoic almost snarled at him, but regained control at the last millisecond. Easy. He's just being helpful. I'm sure Hiccup's fine with Elga still. Stoic. There you are. Some of us were starting to worry, since Sven found this near his house and not a sign of you to be found. Stoic took his battle axe almost reluctantly, feeling rather like a failure at the moment, but as the chief of the tribe, he forced himself to push that aside for now. He had to keep up appearances for the sake of his people, no matter what. He gulped his pounding heart back down to where it belonged and pretended there was nothing wrong with his life right now. Thanks, Gobber. I thought I'd lost it when I threw it at a Storacutter. HMMMMPH Gobber grunted, not quite convinced by Stoic's act. He could see that Stoic wasn't quite himself, having been best friends since they were children. Concerned, he followed his leader to the Horferson house and watched him bang on the door, patiently waiting for whatever was wrong to make itself known. Stoic was relieved when the door finally opened and Elga smiled at him as she handed over Hiccup. He was an angel, the little darling. Feel free to bring him over anytime. Astrid actually likes him, unlike that time Helga brought Snotlout over, she wailed the whole time the little Jorgensen was sharing her crib. Stoic actually dropped his battle axe as he reached for Hiccup, and then cradled his son against his chest, exulting in every tiny breath the baby took, a stronger, nearly overwhelming love for his son growing as he treasured the last piece of his wife he'd ever see. Thank you, Elga, he said solemnly. I might have to do that more than you expected, though. He's going to need a nursemaid. Thor, that hurts to say. What? Erupted from the voices of Elga, Gobber, and Hector, who'd come up behind his wife, cradling a sleeping Astrid in the crook of his arm. Stoic kept his gaze firmly on the reddish-brown fuzz on his son's head that was the exact same shade as Valka's beautiful hair while he very reluctantly explained with, "A Storacutter carried her off. Valka is gone." "Oh," Stoic Elga said softly, putting a gentle hand on his arm for a moment. "I'm so sorry. We will miss her, too. But don't worry about Hiccup. I and the other women will make sure he gets all the milk he needs." Stoic nodded once. "Thank you." Mind numb, and head bowed over his son, he turned and walked back up towards his home. Gobber sighed after his friend as he bent down and retrieved the battle axe once again. Poor Stoic. You know he's taking it hard when he forgets his favorite weapon. Hector and Elga nodded in agreement as they watched their chief and friend walk away like the weight of the world had settled on his broad shoulders. They shared a look, so grateful that the same fate hadn't happened to them. That was the first and last time a dragon stole a human from the village, but the war against the dragons intensified tenfold as Stoic's hate for dragons increased as well. They built better weapons to hit the dragons with, such as catapults and tray buckets, and they increased their sentries to have a better warning of a dragon attack. Stoic believed the reason no other humans were ever taken was because of the increased defenses and the stepped-up warfare training he put his people through. In reality, the true reason the dragons weren't interested in the humans was much simpler. None of the other humans were sympathetic to the dragons and they could sense it, being highly empathic and telepathic creatures. After what felt like the entire night, but was actually 3.5 hours of being held in the talons of a flying beast who danced and jumped the clouds like it was a game. Valka was taken to an intimidating-looking island of ice. The Storacutter flew into a cave, agilely navigating through the winding tunnel. After half a minute, it suddenly dropped her. Valka hit the ice floor hard, but immediately bounced back onto her feet. She ignored how her arms tingled with returning circulation and kept an eye on the dragon that landed in front of her. "What are you up to, dragon?" They eyed each other for a minute before the brown dragon turned his back to her and walked further into the tunnel. "Hey! Why did you bring me here?" Valka called after him, cautiously following. The dragon glanced back over his shoulder for half a moment and then walked on. "Rude bastard." Valka frowned at its back, but followed nonetheless. It's not like she had a better option. Swimming home over the vast ocean would be impossible. "I know you can talk, so why don't you demonstrate the ability again?" she called after it. The dragon snorted loudly and looked back at her over his shoulder again. "I will talk when I wish to and not when an impatient, stupid, human female demands it of me." The words rang through her head in an exasperated tone, making Valka smirk as she walked behind the dragon. "Ha! I just got you to talk, so who's the smarter one now?" The dragon froze for half a step before a rumble emerged from his chest that sounded suspiciously like laughter. "Very good, human known as Valka. Very good." Valka smiled to herself as she noticed that the air was getting warmer with every step, even as the tunnel narrowed until it was just big enough for the Storacutter to walk through with his forewings tucked tight to its body. They turned a corner and suddenly the world opened up before her as the dragon moved off to the side so she could see as she came to a stop beside him. Valka gasped as she saw the water and ice paradise filled with dragons of all shapes and sizes. "It's beautiful," she whispered in awe. Staring out over the steaming pools of water with baby dragons playing within, slides of ice with dragons zipping down, and countless ledges and nooks with adults napping on them, Valka felt her heart fill with an emotion that could only be described as home. Despite loving Stoic, she'd always felt different from other Vikings. She'd hated the war with the dragons. Hated the needless killing. Hated how it was accepted as just the way things were. And her husband had never understood her desire for change. Valka released a quiet sigh as the peaceful scene settled in her soul. "Thank you for showing me this," she said to the dragon standing motionless beside her. "I don't suppose you're going to eat me now, are you?" The dragon turned his head and stared at her, reading her emotions or whatever he was doing. And then he grinned, opening his mouth wide and showing a lot of sharp teeth. "Humans don't taste very good, so, no, I'm not going to eat you." Why am I not surprised? He probably tried one of the many who seem to be allergic to bathing. Maybe that's what happened to the missing Thorstens. Valka snorted at her own musings, smiling. "That's what I thought." She studied the dragon for a minute, noting the intelligence and curiosity in his big yellow eyes as he gazed back at her. "Why did you save me? Why did you take me?" He sighed and looked away for a moment, studying the other dragons that were slowly but surely noticing that there was a human in their midst. "Because you are different from the other humans and you didn't belong with them." "You're right about that," Valka admitted. "Thank you, I suppose." He looked at her again and nodded once in acknowledgement. He looked so gentle and friendly now, she was suddenly struck by the urge to touch him. "That's insane." "But I've always wanted to, so." Mentally shaking her head at herself at her stupid impulse, and scrunching up one side of her face in worry, she nevertheless reached out a hand towards his blunt muzzle. She watched with half an eye, ready to snatch her hand back in an instant if the soft look in the dragon's eyes changed, and waited to see what the dragon would do. "If you wish," the amused thought popped into her mind. Stretching out his neck, the Storacutter sniffed her fingers, then licked her hand, and then put its muzzle under it, initiating contact. "You do smell and taste better than the last human, I'll give you that." "Perhaps I should eat you," the dragon teased, his golden yellow eyes twinkling. Valka shivered at feeling living dragon scales under her fingers for the first time, even as she laughed. It was a truly thrilling experience she would never forget. Blue human eyes met dragon yellow and stayed locked as she gently stroked its nose. "Do you have a name?" she murmured. "You know mine, so it's only fair that I know the name of the dragon that is going to be my companion for the foreseeable future." The dragon's eyes widened for a moment before a contented look came over him. Cloudjumper, he rumbled in her mind. My name is Cloudjumper. And with that, he bumped her hand with his nose and then lunged towards her. Valka leaped unintentionally at the sudden movement but forced her muscles to stay still. She was rewarded by having the back of her tunic grabbed gently in his teeth as Cloudjumper picked her up and placed her on his back where the neck met the shoulders. She grabbed a spine on the back of his head as he leapt up into the air and rumbled out a happy roar as he flew over the dragon sanctuary. Valka laughed exultantly as the dragon she now thought of as hers told all of the other curious dragons about his new human pet. With the wind whipping through her long braided hair and a smile plastered to her face, Valka rode her very first dragon as it joyfully circled the massive cave. Hundreds of dragons joined them in a colorful array of species, swooping together just for the joy of it. The feeling of home increased in Valka, and she knew in that moment that she could never go back to Berk, not as long as hunting and killing dragons was the norm. She had just one regret that would haunt her for years. For Valka would be leaving her husband without a wife and her son without a mother. Chapter 2, Playmates. Chapter text. Playmates. With Valka gone, the women of Berk stepped up and took care of Hiccup's needs, but none more so than Alga. Valka had been a very good friend and Alga missed her. Taking care of her son helped fill that gap in her life just enough to dull the ache of her passing. Stoic became a little too overprotective of his smaller than normal son in everyone's opinion but his own. Alga believed that Hiccup needed to be anything but coddled if he was going to thrive in a society of big warriors and wanted to train him alongside her own daughter, who was also petite for a Viking. Stoic wanted to keep him indoors and away from anything that could possibly hurt him as much as possible. Being the chief, and the boy's father, Stoic won that argument. By the time Hiccup was old enough to have an opinion about what he wanted, the pattern had already been set. Stoic was just too afraid of losing his last loved one to risk letting his son become a proper Viking. At least Hiccup had Astrid to keep him entertained. 2 years old. Stoic walked up the wooden ledges from the cove with false cheer as Gobber hobbled down from above to meet him, waving his hook merrily. You're finally back, the stout blacksmith yelled while still a ways away. He was passed by a few wives running down the path to meet their men who'd been fishing for the past week and were now dealing with their catch with excited calls as they tossed barrels of fish onto the docks. Stoic restrained the urge to roll his eyes at that intuitive statement of the obvious and simply walked faster to close the distance between them so he didn't have to yell back. Yeah, we're back. What happened? Gobber asked curiously as he finally just stopped and waited for Stoic to come to him, the lumpy, sloped, wooden path not the easiest for him to negotiate with his very new and unfamiliar peg leg. Courtesy of a monstrous nightmare. Your fishing trips are usually only a couple of days. Some of us were starting to worry you'd met up with pirates or something. Worse than pirates, Stoic grumbled as they continued up the path together. Pirates would have been easily taken care of. We were constantly attacked by dragons. Every time we'd pull up a net full of fish, a dragon would appear out of the water and snatch the entire thing right out of our hands. Then we had to chase down the god's forsaken beast to get our net back, repair it, and try again. We did that for 3 bloody days. Finally killed that pain in the ass Thunderdrum only to have a pod of young squadrons take up where the Thunderdrum left off. I swear they were playing with us. Gobber snorted inelegantly. They probably were. My many times removed grandfather, Bork the Bold, made a few notes about dragons occasionally being devious pranksters. Stoic growled under his breath. Your great whatever grandfather was too curious about dragons by far. Too much time studying and not enough time killing the flying menaces. Maybe there'd be fewer of them now if he had. Gobber raised his hand and hook in a placating motion. Hey. You don't have to bite my head off about it. I'm just quoting from an old book that even you've admitted is occasionally helpful. Stoic heaved a sigh and glanced sideways at his longtime friend. Sorry, buddy. I'm just frustrated and tired right now. I just want to go get my son, eat something that's not hardtack or yak jerky, and sleep for a week. Is that too much to ask? Knowing my life, yes it is. Gobber smiled as they turned up the path to the Horferson house. Nope. I wouldn't think so. Hiccup is just yonder. I have a nice mutton stew simmering in my house that you're more than welcome to, and I'm sure no one would begrudge you an entire night's sleep. They might get a little grumpy if you actually hibernate for a whole week, though, so I wouldn't recommend it, he said teasingly. Stoic shot his second-in-command a grateful look. I don't know what I'd do without you, Gobber. Gobber grinned back as they walked up to the Horferson house. I do. You'd actually get skinny and go stark raving mad while trying to take care of everything yourself, eat yak jerky for the rest of your life, hardly spend any time with Hiccup, and get grumpier than a polar bear interrupted from its dinner. That was frighteningly accurate. I can't cook worth shite. Stoic snorted as he gave the wooden door a healthy bang. You know me too well, old friend. Gobber just grinned wider and bumped his shoulder against Stoic's as the door opened. Hector smiled warmly at the men from behind his long mustache. Come in. Come in, he said heartily, holding the door open for them and then closing it with an enthusiastic swing behind them. The wee ones are in the nursery, playing. Stoic gave Hector a grateful clap on the back. Thanks, friend, for looking after Hiccup. Again. Think nothing of it, Hector said for the 100th time as they walked up the stairs made from a single massive log to the second level. You know we love having him here to keep Astrid happy. We've been trying to make another sibling for her, but, Hector shrugged sheepishly. It hasn't worked so far. But the trying is fun, he added, perking up. And you know Alga just adores the wee Hiccup to no end. That only made Stoic's chest hurt. It should be Valka who adored his son. But she wasn't here, so he pushed the hurt away and told himself he was grateful that Hiccup had such good people looking after him when he couldn't. Which is more often than I care to admit. Putting on a false smile, he simply said, I know. Alga stuck her head out the open nursery door. You three heavy louts make enough noise to summon the gods. Thank you, sweetheart, Hector said with a pleased grin. Alga rolled her eyes to herself as she nodded into the large room filled with handmade toys. You have got to see what they are doing now. Stoic raised a bushy brow. What is it this time? He said as he and the other two men crowded into the room, making it feel positively tiny. Just watch, Alga said, looking down at the two toddlers who had barely glanced up when the males arrived, not being anywhere near as interesting as their game. So Stoic did. While Astrid watched eagerly, nearly bouncing up and down in her impatience, Hiccup made a high, tall, and perfectly straight wall out of alphabet blocks. There were two sets, one that Gobber had carved for Hiccup and another that Astrid had received from her grandparents for her second birthday. You could tell which was which by the color of the wood and the paint used on the letters. As soon as the wall was done, Hiccup would look at Astrid with a grin and say, K, Asti, kill. And boy, would she ever. The tiny girl swung her wooden toy sword like a Valkyrie, yell and all, and sent the blocks flying, making Hiccup laugh in delight. And then they scrambled around the room, giggling, as they gathered up all the blocks and started all over. Because it was backwards to him, it took 3 go-rounds before Stoic noticed that there was a distinct pattern to the blocks that Hiccup set up. Every single time, the top row of blocks spelled out, Astrid's wall. Holy Thor, my son's a genius. He nudged Gobber with more than the necessary amount of enthusiasm. Hey, Gobs. Is it just me, or has my son taught himself how to read? Gobber shook his head slowly in disbelief as he caught what was spelled on the top row just before the blocks flew everywhere again. I don't think it's just you. Thank you, Thor. They both looked over at Alga with thick brows raised up to their hairlines. Did you teach him to read already? Stoic asked incredulously. Alga shook her head, long gold braids swaying with the motion, and a grin plastered to her face, pleased the men had noticed what she wanted them to see. Nope. Wasn't me. But their names are spelt out on some of their things so we know whose is whose. And there's those picture books we read bedtime stories from. One of them has a big wall in it being attacked by a prince to get at the damsel in distress. Hiccup has clearly picked up a few words from familiarity. I'm calling that an understatement. Stoic snorted. You can call it whatever you like. I've never seen a 2-year-old who could spell out words before. I'm declaring my son brilliant here and now. As if anyone could stop you, Gobber teased. Stoic puffed up his chest, crossed his arms over it, and sported a proud grin as they watched the children play for a few more minutes. You know, Stoic said, finally taking more note of Astrid. The girl's got an impressive swing. She's going to make a fine little warrior one day. Hector puffed up in pride too. I always thought so. She takes after her mother, he said with a loving glance at his wife. Alga wrapped an arm around Hector's waist and kissed his cheek. Smart man, she murmured. The children finally tired of their game and decided the adults were worthy of attention. Leaving the blocks scattered all over, they bounced and giggled over to their parents. Astrid looked up at both her parents expectantly. Honey. At the same time, Hiccup plastered himself to Stoic's leg with a happy cry of, Daddy. Stoic bent down and picked him up in a hug, closing his eyes in pleasure at having his son back. Hey, my little Hiccup. Did you miss me? Hiccup buried his tiny hands in Stoic's impressively long and thick beard and nodded solemnly, green eyes wide. Daddy gone too long. Stoic sighed. I know, son. I know. Daddy's sorry. Stupid dragons. Stupid dragons, Hiccup repeated. Stoic nodded. That's right. You remember that one? Stupid dragons. Hiccup nodded back, copying his father. The massive Viking smiled mistily at the tiny boy. My brilliant, genius son. Valka would be so proud of you. Meanwhile, Astrid and her parents had been having an entirely different conversation. Honey, she repeated. Clean up your toys first and then we'll go have dinner, Alga said firmly. But. Toys. But Hick. Now Hector and Alga said at the same time. Astrid's tiny shoulders slumped and she hung her head, her braid falling over shoulder as she sighed in defeat. Okay. She trudged back to the blocks and started kicking them in the vague direction of the boxes they belonged in, grumbling about how it wasn't fair. Noticing this, Hiccup squirmed to get down and ran over to Astrid and started picking up as many blocks as he could fit in his arms. I help, Asti. She beamed at him, smacked his cheek in a sloppy kiss just like she'd seen her mother do to her father multitudes of times, and then started picking up blocks in a more civilized fashion. Thanks, Hicksai. The children had the blocks stacked neatly in their boxes, even divided correctly by set, thanks to Hiccup, in only a few minutes. And then they ran back to their parents. Now dinner. Astrid said, looking way up. Now dinner, Alga said, smiling, as she bent down and picked up her daughter, hugging her. That goes triple for us, Stoic said as he picked up Hiccup again. Uncle Gobber's got some mutton stew waiting for us at his place. Yeah. 7 years old. Astrid climbed up the plank wall at the back of the Haddock house with deft movements until she reached the closed shutters to the window of Hiccup's second-floor room. In the dark, and with most of the village occupied with a dragon raid taking place in the northern yak pasture, Astrid wasn't worried about being spotted. She reached up and banged on the closed shutters until Hiccup unlatched them and swung them open above her head. Climbing the last plank, she heaved herself up and into his room, dropping down on his bed with a grin. Hiccup just shook his head at her from where he knelt on his bed, a resigned look on his face. I know, I'm bad, Astrid said with a giggle. But you have to come with me this time, Hiccup. Don't you want to see the dragons? Please, please come see our parents fight the dragons. They're so awesome. You know I do, more than anything. But Dad said I was to stay in the house whenever the dragons were nearby or I'd regret the consequences. Hiccup shrugged. Don't know what the consequences are, but I don't know if I want to find out. His brain shuffled through some of the options he'd previously thought up. Maybe no food. Or no books. Or the absolute worst, no Astrid. Don't be a baby, the girl said with an exaggerated roll of her sky blue eyes. Your dad loves you. What's he gonna do? Lock you in your room even more often. Seriously, Hiccup, get your butt down that wall and come with me. You're never going to be able to prove to your dad that you've got what it takes to be a dragon fighter if you don't even know what they look like. Hiccup sank into himself in defeat, his shoulders meeting his ears. Even Thor knows she's right. You do have a point with that one. I guess it wouldn't hurt anything to go see a dragon fight as long as we stay hidden and are back before the adults. Astrid beamed. That's the spirit. She scrambled back out the window and was down the wall in 5 seconds flat, dropping the last meter to the ground easily. Hiccup shook his head at himself, tugged on a fur vest for warmth over his green tunic, and then followed his best friend out the window. I can't believe I'm doing this. Dad will kill me if he finds out. His climb down wasn't quite as graceful, but he made it without falling, so he considered that a win. Astrid was bouncing on her toes, impatient to get going. "Geez, you're slow," she said as soon as he was standing solidly on the ground beside her. "Come on, Hiccup, let's see if you can keep up with me this time." She immediately took off in a sprint across the hill and towards the northern pasture, across a bridge and up a small cliff from the village. Hiccup ran after her, puffing a little to keep up, and forcing his legs to propel him faster. The girl was incredibly fast and in much better shape than him, since her mother Dee had her in warrior training from the age of 2. Hiccup, on the other hand, only got to train when he and Astrid were left alone to play, or she snuck up to his room like this when the parents were away. His dad much preferred that Hiccup spend his time apprenticing in Gobber's blacksmith shop than learning warrior skills. Most days, Hiccup was all right with that, since he loved working with metal, and Uncle Gobber was entertaining to be around. But he'd much rather spend his time with Astrid and not feeling like an infant to be coddled. They reached the top of the cliff in only minutes, thanks to Astrid's nimble feet and Hiccup's determination to not be left behind. They were accompanied by the ever-clearer sound of dragon and Viking roars and the crash of boulders striking the earth from the catapults set up on the edges of the pasture above them. Once there, they dropped to a crouch and moved from rock to rock until they reached the edge of the massive grassy field set on a long and gentle slope. The entire time they were waddling like ducks, Astrid was basically pulling Hiccup along by his sleeve because he couldn't take his eyes off the star-studded sky and the flying creatures outlined within. "They are magnificent," he breathed when they stopped moving, eyes flitting from a large spike-covered dragon to a stocky one with tiny wings that looked like they couldn't possibly keep the dragon up in the air. "Yeah, I suppose," Astrid admitted as she grabbed Hiccup's arm again and tugged. "But look at my mom. She's battling a monstrous nightmare all by herself." "Whoa," Hiccup breathed, impressed. They watched the woman and the flaming dragon exchange blows and bursts of fire for a minute before Hiccup was distracted by something else. A boulder soared towards a two-headed one that was flying with determination after the stampeding yaks who were essentially trapped on the cliff-top summer pasture. "Watch out," Hiccup thought as he held his breath in fear for the beast. The dragon dodged the boulder easily and he breathed again in relief. "Wait. I'm cheering for the enemy." "Bad, Hiccup. Bad. Watch the Vikings. Cheer for them. Cheer for the..." His eyes widened as his dad ran past their hiding spot, yelling a war cry and shaking his battle axe at the tail end of the two-headed dragon that was now carrying a wailing baby yak in its claws. Stoic threw the battle axe with a mighty heave. One of the double-sided blades struck true in the dragon's leg and it dropped the baby yak with a dual yelp from its two heads. Stoic caught the baby yak with a triumphant smirk. "Whoa." Hiccup was seriously impressed. "Go, Dad." Hiccup couldn't help but shout before clapping a hand over his mouth in horror. Too much cheering. Too much. He ducked down behind the rock and stared at Astrid with big eyes. "What did I just do?" Stoic's head whipped towards Hiccup's hiding spot, positive he'd heard his son's voice. "If he's here. By Thor, is he ever?" Out of instinct, he dropped the baby yak even as the hideous Zipliback tore the axe out of its leg with one of its heads and spit it back out at Stoic with a burst of electricity. Stoic threw himself to the side, just avoiding getting struck by his own axe that was now sparking. Rolling to his feet, he left the axe on the ground for the moment and stalked towards the rocks at the edge of the field. The baby yak bellowed in fear and galloped back towards the herd, crying for its mama. Peeking around the rock, Astrid took one look at the chief's murderous expression and gulped. "We're so dead." "Now you've done it," Astrid muttered. She jumped to her feet, pulling Hiccup up with her. "Running would be a good idea right now," she said even as she was putting action to words. Hiccup ran, trusting Astrid's word on the matter. He was afraid to look back and see his dad's displeasure and disappointment. Stoic stopped and narrowed his eyes under furrowed brows as he watched the two children race for the path that led down the cliff, not even bothering to try and hide themselves. "Hiccup horrendous Haddock III, he yelled after them. "You better be in your room when I get home." Hiccup flinched as he ran, never having heard such a tone of anger from his dad before. At least, not directed at him. As the children disappeared from sight, Stoic growled and then stalked back to his axe. "Bloody child. Is he trying to get himself killed?" He picked it up, ignoring the residual heat in the handle. He knows I can't bear to lose him too. Stoic stomped across the field and took up a defensive position near the yak herd again, just itching for another dragon to try and steal a beastie so he could work out some of his fear and anger on it. Hiccup ran like his feet had wings and found himself back below his bedroom window in what felt like an instant. He skidded to a halt and finally dared to look back, more than half expecting to see his father bearing down on him with axe raised high above his head and a murderous look in his eyes. But his dad wasn't there. Thank the gods. Hiccup gulped in great gasps of air as he leaned back against the wall of his house in relief and rested his hands on his knees. Astrid settled beside him, barely breathing hard at all, and started to giggle. That soon built up into peals of laughter and she slid down the wall to sit on the ground. Hiccup just stared at her like she'd lost her mind. Eventually he said, "So. Are you nuts? My dad caught us." Astrid shook her pale blonde head, tears of laughter leaking from her eyes. She wiped them away with a furred forearm cover as she got herself back under control. "That was awesome, Hiccup, truly awesome. The very first time I talk you into doing something even remotely dangerous and you managed to blow it within minutes. Did you see your dad? He looked madder than any dragon I've ever seen by far. Oh, Thor, I'm going to remember this forever, what an epic night." "Oh, it was epic all right, epically terrible. I never should have left my room." Hiccup glared at his friend as he sank down to the ground beside her and wrapped his arms around his legs. "I'm glad you had fun," he grumbled, his tone saying the complete opposite of his words. "But you're not the one who's going to become dragon bait soon. I'm sure I'll make a tasty little snack to lure the dragons with." Astrid punched him in the arm. "Don't be such a drama queen. Your dad won't feed you to the dragons." Hiccup rubbed his arm and glared at her some more. "I wouldn't be too sure about that. The rumors say that's what he did to the last person who disobeyed his rules." Astrid snorted. "You mean Harry Hander? I heard Mom tell Dad he was banished for stealing sheep, not fed to the dragons. I think the rumors were just started to help keep others in line, like ghost stories." Hun, Hiccup said, only a little relieved. He was still worried about what the unknown consequences were for his disobedient actions. He huffed out a sigh and plunked his head back against the wall, staring up at the stars and the glow of firelight coming from the top of the cliff. "I don't know if it was worth it, but thanks for talking me into going up there, Astrid. I loved seeing the dragons up close. They're even more beautiful than I imagined." Astrid smiled as she nudged her shoulder against his. "You're welcome, Hiccup." They both looked up at the sky in comfortable silence for a minute before she sighed. "I guess I better go back home now." She jumped to her feet and walked backwards as she said, "I'll see you tomorrow. Good luck with your dad." "Thanks," he called back sarcastically as she grinned and waved before spinning on the ball of a foot and dashing off in a sprint into the night towards her home situated lower on the mountainside. Heaving himself onto his feet, Hiccup looked up at his window high above his head and sighed. He could climb, or he could pick the lock to his room. Picking the lock sounded like more fun, but he really did need to get better at climbing quickly so Astrid couldn't complain about his climbing skills anymore. Sighing one more time, just because, he stuck his fingers into the highest gap in the planks he could reach and started climbing. After what felt like hours, the dragons finally gave up and flew away, those that hadn't been killed, that is. Stoic joined the cleanup crew as they dragged and heaved dragon bodies out of the field and tossed them over the cliff and into the ocean below. After people took their prizes of teeth and claws and horns, that is. The meat and hides were not used for food or survival unless it was a last resort since the meat tasted like ashes and the hides were too scaly. And then they gathered up all the boulders and rolled them back to the catapults in preparation for the next attack. At some point during all that, Stoic found himself rolling a boulder beside Alga. "Guess who snuck up to watch the fight?" he said in a disgusted tone. Alga raised a brow and shook her head. "You had to know it was going to happen sometime, Stoic. Your boy is intelligent and curious." "And Astrid? Well, let's just say she's got a determined streak in her wider than your belt. I knew that she's been following me, and honestly, I don't see anything wrong with it. The kids need to learn how to fight the dragons sometime. Observation is a very good start. Hiccup doesn't Even observing is too dangerous, Stoic grumbled unintelligibly under his breath, knowing Alga would probably smack him over the head with her axe if she actually heard him say it. Alga forged on, despite her chief's mulish expression, having come up with an idea recently that she was quite fond of, while thinking of her daughter's future. In fact, the old method of simply throwing the teenagers into battle isn't the most ideal situation. Too many of them get hurt or lose limbs in their first few battles until they get smarter. I was thinking we should start an actual dragon fighting program for the kids where they could learn in a controlled environment. Stoic stopped pushing his boulder and gawked at Alga's back as she continued for a few rolls before noticing he had stopped. Is she proposing that we capture dragons to use as training aids? That's insane. But I think I like it. She turned back and stared at him. So, what do you think? She asked him when he still didn't say anything for a minute. Stoic was working through the idea in his mind and images of an enclosed training ring were forming. A slow grin spread under his mustache. I think it's brilliant. We'll start building the ring tomorrow. No time to waste while we have good weather, after all. Alga smiled widely. Great. She turned and started pushing her boulder again, her chief quickly catching up. So, what are you going to do about Hiccup? Do you still mean to keep him from training like a proper Viking? Would it be so bad if I did? Stoic shrank a little into himself as his movements became methodical. I don't know, Alga. He's just so little and fragile. What if he gets hurt? I don't think I could bear it. Alga still didn't agree with Stoic on this, but she let it drop. All right, Stoic. He is your son, so you know best. Just go easy on him when you get home, okay? There was no harm done in him coming out with Astrid to watch a fight. No, I guess not, but there could have been. A dragon could have snatched him and I'd have lost him too. He narrowed his eyes at the woman. That daughter of yours is a bad influence on my son. I think she's exactly what he needs, Alga said in retaliation. Hiccup would wilt to nothing if she wasn't constantly encouraging him to be active. At least he'd be safe. Stoic all but yelled. Ark, she yelled back. You're the archipelago's most stubborn male. I'm so glad I didn't choose you as my mate when both you and Hector were courting me all those years ago. Stoic flinched, having temporarily forgotten that brief period in his life before he'd met Valka at a tribe gathering. So am I. He shoved his boulder the last couple meters to the pile with a mighty heave and stomped away before he completely annihilated his long friendship with the woman. Stubborn, interfering, besom. Hector walked up to Alga and joined her in watching their chief's stiff form retreat from the field. What was that all about? He asked, dying of curiosity, only overhearing the last part. Alga shot him a look as she wrapped her arms around his waist and leaned her head on his shoulder. Just Stoic being his stubborn self again. As usual. But he did like my idea about using real dragons to train the children, so that's something. She breathed in her husband's familiar scent overlaid by the strong scent of smoke as his arms closed around her in return. Alga smiled up at him. Thank you for being you, Hector. You have no idea how much dealing with Stoic makes me appreciate you. Hector raised a brow and kissed her forehead. Thank you. But really, what did our chief do this time? Alga explained. Stoic stomped into his house, up the stairs to Hiccup's bedroom, pulled the key to the room out of the pouch on his belt, unlocked the door, and slammed it open. Despite hearing his father coming up the stairs, Hiccup jumped anyway and then huddled even further away from the door against the wall behind his bed. Consequences. Here come the consequences. Oh, Thor. Stoic glared at his son from under thunderous bushy brows, a little ashamed to see his son afraid of him, which just made him angrier. You're not to see that girl ever again. Stoic declared before grabbing the door and slamming it closed. He stomped back down the stairs and then flopped into his favorite chair in front of the fire, all the anger melting from him and leaving him feeling very old and very tired at only 37 years. Hiccup stared at the closed door in shock for a few minutes before slow and silent tears escaped his eyes. His dad had found the one thing that Hiccup considered worse than being used as dragon bait, being separated from Astrid. Consequences had become the worst possible thing that he had imagined. Fortunately for Hiccup, Astrid really was the most determined child in the world. She managed to obey the chief's edict that she not go near Hiccup ever again for a whole week before she couldn't take it anymore, missing her friend something awful. She couldn't get to Hiccup's room anymore from the outside because Stoic had covered the planks in tree sap that was nearly impossible to get off her hands and clothes and was a dead giveaway of whenever she tried to climb them. So she waited for just the right circumstances when Stoic was down at the docks, preparing to leave the village for a chieftain's meeting, and Gobber had been called away from his shop to deal with something or other. Sneaking from shadow to shadow, she dashed into the blacksmith shop through the rear entrance, startling Hiccup into dropping a glowing orange rod of metal he'd been carrying with tongs. "Astrid," he exclaimed as he quickly picked up the rod again before it left too bad of a black mark on the stone floor. "Gods, I missed you." Putting the glowing rod on an anvil, he braced himself for the impact as she ran over and hugged him with all of enthusiasm her wiry little body was capable of. "You're not supposed to be here," he said, even as he hugged her just as tightly back. Astrid pulled away as she grinned at her best friend. "As if some stupid rule could keep me away from you. Your dad would have to banish me from the island for that to ever happen, and even then, I'd probably still sneak back and visit you." Stoic paused as he walked into Gobber's shop, looking for his friend, and shook his head as he heard Astrid's heartfelt words. A reluctant smile formed. "Why, I thought I could separate those two when one of them is Astrid the Determined is beyond me. Maybe Thor knows." Continuing on into the back room, he leaned against the doorway as the kids looked up at him guiltily. "I hereby rescind my decree based on what I just heard." "But," he said, holding up a finger before they could celebrate, "if you come anywhere near a dragon battle again, Hiccup, I can guarantee that you won't be sitting down for a month. Do you understand me?" Hiccup nodded almost frantically, eyes wide. "Yes, Dad. No more dragons." "Got it. Astrid's worth all the dragons in the world." Stoic nodded once. "Good." He shot a warning look at the girl who had a speculative and scheming look on her little face. "And I will lock him in his room for a month, girl, so you better wipe whatever thoughts you're having right out of your head if you want your friend accessible to you, understood?" Astrid heaved a sigh, crossed her arms, and glared at the massive man, but nevertheless said, "Yes, sir. Mom's right, he is an overbearing jackass. We'll just have to work around his idiocy." Stoic raised a brow at her less than respectful tone, but let the insolence slide, since she wasn't his child to discipline. "Good." Spinning on his foot, the chief of Berk left the blacksmith shop. The children looked at each other and smiled as they realized they could see each other again without Astrid having to sneak. They whooped, hugged again, and then Astrid sat on an overturned crate and watched Hiccup bang the metal rod into something useful while they talked animatedly about everything they'd done for the past week. Hiccup couldn't wipe the smile off his face all day after that. It was good to have his friend back. Chapter 3, Attraction. Chapter text. Attraction. 13 years old. Astrid threw the double-sided axe at the target with every ounce of strength that she had as it rolled by on its cart, courtesy of a massive shove by her father. She only had time to confirm that the blade struck true in the neck of the dragon-shaped target made of yak leather and straw before the hairs rose on the back of her neck in warning. Spinning, she drew the sword off her back just in time to block the sneak attack of Rough Nut. The girls exchanged fleeting grins before donning their mock skulls as their swords clashed with a clang. Astrid parried back and forth with the taller girl for a minute before she got that tingling sense of warning again. Whirling once more, but keeping Rough Nut in her peripheral vision, she snarled at Tough Nut as he came at her with his sword raised overhead for a downward blow. Blocking it, she kicked him back with a foot to the stomach and then swung back around to parry yet another swing from his 12-year-old twin sister. Nearby, in the relatively flat and grass-covered ground centuries of Burkians had designated as a sparring area, the other two boys in their age group also sparred back and forth with dull metal swords. Snotlout was shorter than Fishlegs but a year older and by far the more confident of the two. But what Fishlegs lacked in confidence, he made up for in sheer size and strength, being the epitome of a brawny Viking. In fact, he was the only one of their training group who fit that description. Unfortunately, in Astrid's opinion, he wasn't inclined to take advantage of that strength, being more inclined towards reading than training. Snotlout was stout and muscular, but even shorter than Astrid. The blonde-haired twins were quite tall and towered over Astrid, but they were very slender still. Astrid mostly tuned out Snotlout's mocking taunts to poor Fishlegs as she concentrated on the twins with narrowed eyes. As they advanced on her in a synchronized stalk, she made a strategic retreat to where the cart had come to rest up against a boulder. Reaching behind her with her right hand, she yanked her axe out of the straw dragon and the wood of the cart. Aha! Oh, the twins said as Astrid smirked and twirled her axe and sword around her fingers with practiced ease. You know it, suckers. Are you ready to die? Astrid taunted the twins as she now advanced on them, axe in one hand and sword in the other. Nope, Tough Nut squeaked. Perhaps Rough Nut said with a shrug. Astrid mentally rolled her eyes at the weird boy who seemed to have his priorities somewhat askew. They should have called him One Nut. That was all the time Astrid gave them before she went all Badis Valkyrie on them, sword and axe ringing sweet notes of victory in the air as she exchanged blows with the twins. She drove them further and further backward until they stood on the edge of the cliff that bordered their sparring area, and then with a deft twist of the axe, disarmed them both. Pointing her weapons at their necks, Astrid raised the eyebrow that wasn't covered by her bangs. Do you yield? Yes. No. Rough Nut shoved an elbow into her brother's side. He changed his answer to no, but sounded anything but happy about it. Astrid grinned. Excellent. Time to give the twins a much-needed bath. And with a flying kick that made her braid lift off her back and her spiked skirt twirl, she kicked Tough Nut off the cliff. He was still screaming when Rough Nut grinned as she received a boot to the stomach as well. The girl laughed as she fell, turning the drop into a backwards dive into the ocean a few meters below. Astrid watched them fall with a triumphant smile and returned Rough's wave when she popped back up to the surface of the ocean. That girl isn't exactly normal either, gotta admit. And now, to deal with the remaining Viking wannabes. Methinks they are in need of good bath as well. As Astrid turned her sights on the last two boys, the cart went zooming past again. Changing her grip quickly, she threw her sword at it and the tip embedded itself in the chest of the fake dragon. Flipping Rough Nut's sword off the ground with a toe, she caught it and continued her stalk towards her last two targets. Is that the best you can do, Jellyfish Legs? Snotlout sneered as he kept up a steady attack on Fishlegs' defenses. Fishlegs was essentially just holding his shield in front of him and letting it take the brunt of the blows. Come on. Attack me back. Be a man for once. Fishlegs swung his sword half-heartedly at Snotlout, inspiring an eye roll from both Snotlout and Astrid. Technically, neither of us are men yet, Fishlegs pointed out. We don't receive that title until we've defeated a dragon after turning 14. I know that, stupid legs, the shorter boy sneered. Astrid cleared her throat loudly to get their attention, since they had completely ignored her march up to their pathetic excuse of a fight. When that still didn't do the trick, she gave up and threw her axe directly between them, the metal reflecting glints of sunlight as it spun. What the? Snotlout exclaimed as the axe skimmed uncomfortably close to his nose on the way by. He stared at Astrid with wide eyes. What in Thor's name was that for? Astrid gave him an exasperated look as she walked around him and retrieved her axe from where it had buried itself in the ground. That was for calling Fishlegs names. Could you, for once in your life, just be nice? Snotlout snorted like a yak. Be nice. I don't know this word. Jorgensons don't do nice. I've noticed, Astrid said dryly. She nodded at him with her chin. How about we see if you can actually beat me for once? Oh, you're on, sweet cheeks. Astrid was already swinging at his head with her axe as she growled out, Don't call me that, Jorgensen, or you'll be talking in a squeaky voice for a week. The brown-haired boy just managed to block her axe with his shield before he lost his curly horned helmet. He shot her a hurt look. You wouldn't do that to me, would you, babe? Behind them, Fishlegs was backing up and holding his shield in front of his crotch, just in case. Astrid continued to rain blows on Snotlout's shield and sword as she backed him towards the cliff. In a heartbeat, and you know it. Or is your memory really that short? Snotlout flushed as he remembered the consequences of a wandering hand when he'd parked himself beside her at a communal dinner last week, right in the spot he knew she'd been saving for Hiccup. Astrid had not appreciated having his hand on her thigh at all or having him take Hiccup's spot. And even more so because he'd managed to work it under her skirt, which he'd thought had been rather clever of him. She'd stood up abruptly, picked up her axe, and then very deliberately dropped it in his lap, head down. He was lucky she hadn't cut anything off, and he knew it. As is, his trousers had needing some repairs and his manhood had been sore for days. "No, I remember," he mumbled. Astrid smirked at him as she saw the acknowledgement of her dead seriousness in his eyes. She'd eat her boot, though, if he actually left her alone. The boy was as dense and conceited as they come. She stopped attacking as he was now exactly where she wanted him. "Just keep your hands to yourself and the comments respectable and we'll get along just fine." And with that, she kicked him right off the cliff and listened with great satisfaction as he screamed like a little girl on the way down. Looking down, she watched him hit the water with an undignified splat and then sink like a floundering rock. The twins were laughing their heads off as they swam for the nearby dock, pausing every couple of seconds to try and drown each other. Snotlout popped back up to the surface and rescued his helmet before it sank and then swam over to where his wooden shield bobbed on the water. He then glared up at Astrid as he floundered in the water. "You made me drop my sword. How am I supposed to get it now? Dad'll kill me if I lose it." "Not my problem," Astrid called back. She smiled to herself as she turned away from the cliff while Snotlout's sputters of outrage rang through the air. She raised a brow at Fishlegs, who'd followed them over and was watching Snotlout with a frown on his face. Noticing her attention was now on him, Fishlegs sighed in defeat and placed his weapons on the ground in front of her. "I'll save you the trouble," he said resignedly. "And I might as well get Snotlout's sword before he drowns himself trying." And then he jumped off the cliff. "That's the only smart boy in the lot," Astrid commented to her father as he walked up and put an arm around her shoulders. Hector laughed as he squeezed her to his side in a half hug for a moment before letting her go. "Excellent training session today. Your mother would be proud of how well you've taken to her old axe. Too bad she's away right now." Astrid twirled said axe around her hand a few times. "I'll show her when she gets back. Any word on how Grandma's doing?" Hector shook his head as they gathered up weapons and tossed everything in the cart. "Not yet." He pulled her sword out of the dragon target and frowned at the tip, or at least, where the tip used to be. "Geez, Astrid, you broke it. I'm impressed." Astrid put her axe in its sheath across her back and took the sword from her father as he handed it to her. "Wow. There's like a whole finger's width missing. Do you think Gobber can fix it?" she asked hopefully. Hector shrugged. "Don't know, but you might as well go give it to him and see what he says. I'll round up your swimming victims, run them through a few more drills, and then have them help me finish cleaning up here. As the winner of the day," again he winked, "you can have the rest of the afternoon off." Astrid beamed at her dad. "Thanks, Daddy. I'll see you at home for supper later." "Sure. Say hi to Hiccup for me," he called after her back as she'd already turned and started jogging away. Astrid raised the sword in acknowledgement and ran faster, eager to spend a couple hours with Hiccup. It only took her 5 minutes to make the trip to what could be called downtown Burke, if you were generous. Aside from Gobber's smithy, there was also Big Bertie's pub and Thrifty Thunderer's trading post on the same street. Astrid went in the front door of the smithy and found Gobber already talking to a customer, haggling over the price of the broadsword lying on the counter from the sounds of it. When Gobber noticed that she didn't immediately head to the back to talk to Hiccup like she normally would have, he raised a brow at her over the shoulder of the customer. Astrid raised the damaged training sword in explanation. Gobber whistled in appreciation, pausing his conversation. Both men took a step nearer to examine the sword better. "What did you do to it?" Gobber asked as he poked at the jagged end with a finger. Astrid shrugged casually. "I threw it like a spear at the dragon cart." "Did it work?" "Oh yeah." Gobber ruffled her hair and grinned at her approvingly. "Good for you. But as for the sword, it'll never be quite the same. Shorter for sure. But I think I can fix it. But first, give it to Hiccup and see what he can do with it. Boy likes a challenge." "Sure," Astrid said eagerly. She smoothed her bangs back into their customary place over the left side of her face as she walked into the back room and was immediately struck by a wave of heat. The forge was roaring hot as Hiccup worked over it, banging a red-hot strip of metal into the vague shape of a sword with a big hammer. She knew that Hiccup would work over that metal for hours, heating, folding, and flattening it again and again until it became indestructible steel. Well, as she looked at her broken sword, it's supposed to be indestructible, anyway. Hey, hick. She started to say, but her words faded away as she took in his appearance. Being the one whole month of summer, he was only wearing a thin, short-sleeved green tunic on his upper half, and it was plastered to his chest from the same sweat that glistened on his forehead. He was still short and scrawny for a Viking, but from his work in the smithy and their clandestine training, his arms were cored with lean muscles. And his chest and abs were shaping up nicely too, she couldn't help but notice. Oh, yummy. Gulping, and flushing from more than the heat in the room, she resisted the urge to fan herself like a simpering female. Get a grip, girl. He's not ready for you to pounce on him like a cat in heat. Maybe he never will be. Thor, what a depressing thought. Hiccup was her best friend, and, as far as she could tell, he was content to stay that way. There was no point making things awkward between them yet by letting on that she found him cute as hell with those dreamy gem-green eyes and his shaggy auburn hair that had a complete mind of its own. His sweet smile didn't hurt anything either. Her mother said not to worry about his apparent contentedness with their current relationship because boys were much slower to mature and could be ridiculously obtuse when it came to seeing what was right in front of them. Astrid was counting on that to be true and figured she could wait another year or two for Hiccup to figure things out on his own. If he hadn't by then, well, she might just have to tackle him to the ground and kiss him until he figured out that she was a girl. Clearing her throat loudly to be heard over the ringing of the hammer, she tried again. Hey, Hiccup. Hiccup looked up and around, beaming that glorious smile at Astrid that made her heart stutter in her chest. He put the strip of metal back in the fire to heat again as he said, Hey, Astrid. How was training today? He asked as they walked towards each other. It was good, Astrid said, not one to boast. Same old. She held out the sword for him to see. Except for this. I kind of broke it. Her stomach developed a case of butterflies as he stopped in front of her, close enough to smell. Inexplicably, his fresh sweat scent just added to the weird things her insides did whenever she was in close proximity to him. Hiccup chuckled as he took the sword and stared at the end assessingly for a few seconds. I see that. I'm guessing, from what I know about you and how this broke, that you hucked it at something like it was a spear and that snapped the end off. Astrid was once again impressed by his powers of deduction. Wow, you're good. The end is embedded in the dragon cart. Hiccup shrugged, blushing slightly at the praise. It was just a matter of simple logic. Astrid was still impressed. Anyway, Gobber says you get to try and fix it first. Hiccup's emerald eyes lit up as he gazed at the broken sword with increased interest. Sweet. I want his eyes to light up like that for me, she thought whimsically. Astrid smiled sappily at his back as he hurried back to the forge and put half the sword in the fire. Picking up the other length of metal with his thick leather-gloved hand, he said, You have an hour. For you, I have eternity. But those words were kept tight to her chest and she only let out a simple, yep. Astrid pulled her axe off her back and leaned it against her customary crate that now had a cushion of folded grain sacks on top, courtesy of Hiccup. Sitting, she added, in fact, I have the rest of the day off from training, so you get me until supper time. Also sweet, Hiccup said with a grin over the fire at her. Maybe you and your dad can come to my house for supper tonight. I've got a fish soup slow cooking over the hearth and someone brought some blueberries over as a gift for Dad, so there's some blueberry pie left over from yesterday. That sounds wonderful. We'll definitely be there. Dad and I are seriously missing Mom's cooking right now, she said with an exaggerated roll of her eyes. We try, honest we do, but somehow, everything always ends up burnt or just flat out tastes awful. We've been living off of yak jerky sandwiches for the last couple of days. Hiccup chuckled, smirking at her. It's a good thing that I actually learned the lessons your mother taught us about cooking, then, isn't it? That's because you're a know-it-all who soaks up any and all knowledge like a sponge, she retaliated in the same teasing tone he used. Hiccup sent her a cheeky wink and then returned to his task. She watched him bang on the metal for a couple of minutes before he stuck it back in the fire. He pulled the broken sword out, frowned at it for not being hot enough yet, and then put it back in. Gods, even his frown is cute. So Hiccup said, leaning casually against the huge anvil only a couple steps away from the forge. "Tell me what really happened with training today. You wouldn't have the afternoon off unless something exciting happened." Astrid crossed her arms over her chest and raised a brow. "Why would you think that?" Hiccup smirked as he crossed his arms right back. "Because I know you. And because the other kids haven't made an appearance yet to taunt me with how they are becoming great warriors and I'm a pathetic wimp who's never going to be a proper man." Hiccup rolled his eyes at this, more or less having accepted his lot in life by this point. "That means they are still training, which means that you should be too. Unless you did something spectacular to earn a couple hours off. So spill." Astrid sighed in defeat. "He knows me too well, by far. Or maybe that's a good thing. I hit every target today with my axe. I'm really getting the hang of it. Man, I wish Mom would come home so I could show her," she added wistfully. "That can't be all," Hiccup said. "You've always had excellent aim, no matter what weapon you're using." Astrid flushed slightly at the praise and stroked her braid self-consciously. "Thanks," she mumbled. "I may have defeated all of the kids multiple times over the course of the day, and I may have kicked them all off the cliff and into the ocean. Except for fish legs," he voluntarily jumped. Hiccup gawked at her for a few seconds before he burst into laughter. "Oh, Thor, I wish I'd seen that. It would have made my day to see Snotlout floundering around in the water. In fact, just imagining it is enough to make my day. Maybe even my week." He shook his head as he went back to the forge and fished out the broken sword, then smiled at the while-hot end. "Perfect. Just to make your day a little bit better," Snotlout screamed like a little girl as he fell. Astrid volunteered. Hiccup looked up at her and grinned widely. "Excellent. I'm adding that to my mental image right now." Astrid giggled as he returned his focus to the sword, banging away at the end in an effort to reshape the metal that was left. "Thor, that is so hot. I could watch him swing that hammer all day." For the next little while, she simply enjoyed watching him work over the two swords in turns, having nothing else pressing to talk about at the moment. It was hard to hear over the banging of the hammer anyway, and working on the hot metal was time-sensitive. At some point, she ran her hand over her braid and finally noticed a good third of her hair wasn't actually in the braid anymore. Since that just wouldn't do, and feeling embarrassed about being so disheveled looking in front of Hiccup, she pulled the leather tie off the bottom to fix it. She knew it was silly, considering he'd probably seen her in every possible state of cleanliness and /or dishabille over the years, but she was now hormone-bound to follow the urge that said she needed to be as pretty as possible in front of Hiccup. Hiccup glanced up at Astrid between swings and time slowed down to individual milliseconds as his life was forever changed by a sudden realization that Astrid was drop-dead beautiful. "Oh my Thor. How have I missed that?" In what felt like perpetual slow motion, he watched in stunned awe as she shook a veritable cascade of white blonde and gold hair around her shoulders. The multi-hued strands were soft-looking and glittered in the reflected firelight, and they curled slightly nearly all the way down to her waist. Then she ran her fingers through it in what might have been a quick motion, but to him it felt like 3 hours, at the very least, before pulling the entire mass over her shoulder again and dividing it into 3 sections for rebraiding. Her sky-blue eyes glanced up, caught him looking at her, prompting a shy smile from her. Hiccup stared at those eyes like he'd never seen them before, just now realizing how incredible the color was. Meanwhile, his arm had been swinging in an automatic motion, but without looking at what he was doing, and his suddenly nerveless left hand forgetting how to hold on to the end of the metal strip, he hit the metal wrong and it fell off the anvil and directly onto his boot. Hiccup didn't notice. Not right away. Not until he swung the hammer again and the clang sounded wrong as the hammer struck the much denser metal of the anvil. And then he smelled the burning leather of his boot, which was nowhere near as thick as the glove he wore on his hand. And the hottest part of the metal had landed on his boot, of course, because Loki liked to mess with him like that. His eyes widened and a very ungentlemanly "Fuwa escaped his mouth. He kicked the metal off of his boot, then hopped around on the other as the burning hot sensation registered in his foot. Thor's right butt cheek, he cursed as he hastily pulled off his boot and wool sock, which both had holes in them, and examined the top of his foot with relief. It was red, but not blistered, thank Thor. Meanwhile, Astrid had jumped off her crate, partial braid coming undone again as she did so, and had hurried over to see if Hiccup was all right. "Did you burn it?" she asked as she peered at his foot as well. She breathed a sigh of relief when she saw his bare foot was relatively all right. She also couldn't help but notice how much bigger his foot was since the last time she'd seen his feet bare. It was surely inches longer than hers now. Someone's growing. Now his body just needs to catch up to his feet. Hiccup was still shaking his head as Gobber ran into the back, exclaiming, "What happened?" "No, it's okay," Hiccup finally answered Astrid's question. "A little of Gothai's healing cream and it'll be fine." "But my boot," he held it up and everyone gawked at the ruined boot that had a huge hole in the top of the foot. "I don't think I can save this one." Gobber looked from the ruined boot to the half-formed sword on the stone floor and figured out the answer to his question on his own. He shook his head at Hiccup. "I understand the dropping of the sword on your foot part, done that more than once myself, but what inspired you to let it sit there long enough to do that to your boot?" "Oh, gods." Hiccup flushed beet red and looked anywhere but at Astrid as he frantically thought up a believable answer. "I was thinking about my new design for a dragon-catching bowler launcher." Gobber rolled his eyes in exasperation. "Not that again. I told you your dad's never going to let you get close enough to a dragon to try it out on. Give up already, kid. You'll rest easier for it." Hiccup's shoulders slumped as he waved his holy sock a few times to cool it off before putting it back on, since a holy sock was better than the cold stones of the smithy floor. "I know, Gobber. Trust me, I know. I just wish he could see that I could be helpful despite being small." Gobber clapped a big hand on his shoulder and squeezed affectionately. "So do I, Hiccup." With a shake of his head he went back to the front of the shop to deal with another customer who was commissioning a new set of armor. Hiccup sighed as he tossed the boot into the corner full of leather scraps used for various handle wrappings and armor fixings. "I still can't believe I did that." Then he retrieved the sword from the floor and stuck it back in the fire and pulled out the other one before it melted completely. He glanced at the girl still hovering at his side from under his lashes and was presented with an eyeful of the small mounds on her chest that her form-fitting blue shirt did absolutely nothing to hide. He almost swallowed his tongue. And how in Thor's name did I not notice till now just how astonishingly beautiful Astrid is? But she's my best friend. Am I even allowed to think of her as a girl? Astrid touched his back in sympathy for a moment and Hiccup nearly flinched from the touch. He was so confused by his own emotions. "I'll go get some cream for your foot and bring you back the spare set of boots from your room, okay?" His smile was a little wobbly as he nodded once. "Sure, Astrid. That would be great." He pretended to concentrate on the sword until he was sure she was no longer looking at him, and then he gave up all pretense and just watched her figure walk out the back door of the smithy with wide eyes as he took in the even more startling fact that Astrid was starting to get curvy in the hip department as well, making her narrow waist look even smaller. And her gorgeous, multi-hued hair tumbled down nearly all the way to that trim waist and swayed with her graceful steps. "Yeesh." Hiccup gulped, his hands suddenly trembling and his body going on high alert. He very carefully avoided the hot sword as he all but collapsed down to the floor on knees that felt like noodles and leaned his head back against the base of the anvil, staring up at the ceiling blankly as the image of Astrid walking away from him played over and over in his mind. "I'm in trouble. Big, big trouble. How am I supposed to hide the fact from her that I've suddenly discovered that she's the most beautiful girl I've ever seen?" He didn't know, but he was going to have to. He knew how much she hated Snotlout's attentions, and the other boy was considered a much better-looking Viking than Hiccup, being all brawny and ruggedly handsome. If she didn't want Snotlout, there was no way she'd ever even consider an even smaller and way skinnier non-Viking as a mate. She's so stunning she could be a goddess. She is a goddess. A warrior goddess. She'll never want to settle for pathetic little me. Hiccup shook his head at his hopeless situation, wishing he could take back the last 5 minutes and go back to the way things were before. It was safe and easy when they were just friends. But he knew he couldn't, not now that he'd seen her as a possible mate instead of just a friend. "And I'll just have to live with it, cause Thor knows there's no way I'm ever talking my libido into taking back its epiphany." Hiccup looked down at the strained laces on his trousers with a frown. "Seriously, though, we can't walk around like this every time the goddess is around. You're going to have to take an ice bath or something." He shivered at the thought of shoving ice down his pants, and it was enough to cool off his libido. For now. He'd always loved Astrid in a platonic kind of way, but he knew it would now forever be in the unrequited way. And that hurt way more than he cared to think about. The most beautiful girl on the island is my best friend. Why does that suddenly sound like a curse? Meanwhile, on an island somewhere far, far to the northwest of Berk, a large flock of night furies ranging in age from hatchlings to great-grandparents sunbathed and played in the warm summer sun. A 13-year-old dragon, which would make him about as mature as the average teenage human, since this species of dragon matures very slowly, unlike some others that can reach full adult size in only a year, was flying over the ocean, playing tag with his two younger siblings. The pitch-black dragon's ears suddenly felt the barest hint of a vibration, signaling some kind of unfamiliar sound. Pausing in his graceful play, the night fury turned his head in the direction the sound was coming from. What was that? Noticing their older brother was distracted, the 7-year-old twin swooped in and nipped his wings with tiny bursts of purple plasma. Got you, Toothless, Spin and Fin crowed together. Toothless gave his siblings an annoyed look when they came around for another shot, stopping them in mid-flight. Enough. You win. With a pointed nod of his head, he said, go back to the island. Tell Mom and Dad I'll be back in a bit. I'm just going to go check something out. Do we have to? They whined in unison. Toothless opened his mouth and built up some low-level purple plasma in warning, not needing to add actual words to the unspoken, go or die. Okay, we're going, Fin said quickly. Toothless smirked at them as they hung their heads dejectedly and reluctantly turned around, radiating disappointment that their fun was over. Satisfied that his little brothers were flying back to the safety of the island, the teenage dragon turned his sleek head back to the direction that had caught his attention. The very faint, unknown sound came again. Curious, he flapped his wings and shot through the nearly cloudless sky at a speed so fast, he was nearly invisible. After a minute, he stopped and hovered in the air, head turning from side to side as he waited to see if the sound would appear again. It did. Now really curious, Toothless flew towards the sound again, his echolocation ears vibrating slightly. 5 minutes later, he stopped again, already at least 100 kilometers from his home island. He listened again. The sound, which was actually the call of a massive alpha dragon, vibrated through his ears again. The Night Fury's eyes glazed over as he listened, and he found himself flying once again in the direction of the call, but now doing it without conscious thought. He was still flying hours later when the call suddenly stopped. Blinking, Toothless came back to himself and looked around in confusion. He was over the ocean and there was no land in sight. And, he couldn't sense home anymore. Where am I? A sense of fear overtook him and he cried aloud and mentally for his parents, despite knowing they most likely couldn't hear him. Mom. Dad. A call of, hello, did ring back across the sky, but it most definitely wasn't his parents. Nevertheless, Toothless perked his ears in that direction and flew as fast as he could, which was about 1,500 km an hour, towards the other cry, desperate to not feel lost and alone anymore. Hello, he cried again as he flew, and the other cry echoed him back. In only a minute, Toothless flapped to a halt in the sky as a nearly identically shaped dragon did the same right in front of him, coming from the opposite direction. Hello. What are you? The lost male black dragon looked at the equally lost female white dragon in surprise, having never seen a white version of a Night Fury before. He also couldn't help but notice that she was strikingly beautiful. Toothless purred in pleased surprise. The pearlescent white dragon tilted her head slightly and ogled him in return, a faint purr eventually rumbling from her chest as they flapped their wings slowly to stay above the clouds. Hello, the female said tentatively in his mind. They flew around each other, scrutinizing and studying every tiny detail of the similarities and differences of the other and liking what they saw very much. Hi. I'm Toothless and I'm a Night Fury, he said matter-of-factly after a minute. What are you? My name's Luna, and I'm a Light Fury, the girl dragon replied. Well. We're like opposites, Toothless gushed. Luna giggled. Clearly. Her eyes closed slightly as she studied him some more, liking his clear green eyes. What kind of name is Toothless, anyway? Toothless opened his mouth and showed his grin, minus the retracted teeth, then popped them out before sheathing them in his gums again. Luna rolled her eyes. Yes, that's a cool trick, but all Furies can do that. That still doesn't explain why your parents gave you such a wimpy-sounding name. Hey. I like my name, Toothless protested. It's different. And Mom says she named me Toothless because I didn't pop them out of my gums for weeks longer than most baby dragons. I guess that makes sense, Luna admitted. But it's still a weird name. She kept that last thought to herself, though, not wanting to hurt his feelings. It makes perfect sense, Toothless said proudly. Silence fell between them for a minute, as the awkwardness of two dragons meeting under such strange circumstances suddenly struck them. He eventually worked up the courage to break it. So, what's a pretty girl like you doing out here in the middle of nowhere? Luna repressed the urge to roll her eyes at the much overused pickup line because there actually was a valid question in there. I'm lost, she admitted. Hey. So am I. Toothless exclaimed. You didn't happen to hear a strange call and the next thing you knew you were nowhere near home? That's exactly what happened. Luna said with wide eyes. Weird. So weird. Awkward silence fell again as they continued to hover in the sky. So now what? Luna eventually said. We could fly back to an island I saw a few minutes ago. Toothless offered. The sun is setting and it's probably not smart to try to find our way back to our homes in the dark. That sounds like a good idea to me, Luna admitted. Puffing himself up as big as he could, Toothless preened for the pretty, young dragoness. Luna ducked her blue eyes and chuffed out a laugh. He is awfully cute, even if he is somewhat smaller than me, indicating a slightly younger age. Come on, smart one, let's go see this island of yours. A couple minutes later, they landed on the beach gracefully, if a little tiredly. Toothless filled his chest with fire and lit the sand in a large circle in front of him. Your bed, pretty dragon of light. Luna flushed in pleasure at his poetic words. Thank you, helpful dragon of night. Should I? Oh, what the hell? She walked forward tentatively until, finally, Luna stretched her nose out and touched it to his in a kiss of gratitude. Gem green eyes closed as a purr rumbled from him again, making her smile. Luna purred as well and nuzzled her face against his and then turned to curl up on the nice warm sand he'd provided. Toothless huffed out a pleased sigh that she'd accepted his small gift and then turned away to warm up another circle of sand for himself. But she stopped him with a call. There's plenty of warm sand here. You can join me if you want. Whoa, did I just say that? Dad would have fit if he found out I invited a strange dragon to sleep with me. Really? Toothless said in amazement as he turned back around. Well, I can't take it back now. Really? I just won't tell Dad. Not wanting to give her time to change her mind about sharing space, which was tantamount to declaring friendship at the very least, Toothless curled up behind her and rumbled happily. The two exhausted, confused, and lost teenage dragons took comfort in the presence of the other and fell into a deep sleep. And that was how light met night. But just like Astrid and Hiccup, they had a far from smooth road ahead of them. Chapter 4, The Mating Dance. Chapter text. The Mating Dance. Night Fury Island, 2 hours after Toothless left. Spin and Finn tumbled along the beach, roughhousing and giggling as they tried to pin each other to the sand. They came to an abrupt halt when they rolled right into thick black legs and a large shadow loomed over them. Scrambling to right themselves, they looked up at their father with innocent green eyes from identical faces. We weren't doing anything bad, Daddy, Spin said. Honest, added Finn. Longwing smiled at them gently. Aside from being really late for dinner. I suppose not. But I'm looking for Toothless too. Have you seen your brother lately? The boys thought together, scrunching up their muzzles. We were playing tag with him a while ago, Spin said. Over the ocean, Finn added helpfully. And then he heard something and told us to come back home. And he flew away, Finn finished with. Longwing sighed, shaking his head. That boy is always off exploring something. Come on then, my wee sons. It's practically dark, 10 minutes past your bedtime, and you haven't even had your dinner yet. Your mother is not pleased that all of her children are not where they are supposed to be, so you better be awful good when we get home. As far as your wayward brother is concerned, we'll give Toothless till morning to get back before I get worried about him. Okay, the twins said, unconcerned, as they bounced along the beach beside their father for a couple steps before they all spread their wings and took off for their nesting grounds near the middle of the island. The next morning, on an unknown deserted island, Luna woke up confused for a minute, opening her eyes to an unfamiliar location and finding herself nearly snuggled up beside a virtual stranger. No one would have blamed her if panicking had been her first reaction, but instead, the only thought in her head was, stars, Toothless is freaking cute when he's asleep. Not that he's not also very cute when he's awake, but, look at him. Toothless was lying on his back, one wing outstretched and the other covering his belly. The first glimmers of sunlight glinted off of his scales, bringing out a sheen of dark purple and blue. Such a beautiful color. So different from a light fury, and yet the similarities are quite apparent as well. I wonder what my parents would think of him. Thinking of her parents made their multiple warnings about boys and strangers come rushing back, causing her to bound onto her feet in a rush. She eyed his sleeping form warily as her parents' voices resounded through her mind. Boys only want one thing, Luna. And it's not friendship. Don't talk to strangers, sweetie, it's not safe. And then there was the conversation they'd had that had sent her flying away from home in a huff and had her getting trapped in that hypnotizing call that had eventually led her to meeting Toothless. You're not dating until you turn 14, and that's final. If I catch you gallivanting with a boy before then, you'll be in big trouble. And don't even think about mating with one until you're 16. But Dawad, she'd whined, thinking of the super cute, 15-year-old light fury called Lightning who'd asked her to go fishing with him yesterday. No. Fine. Luna winced as the memory haunted her. If only I hadn't acted like such a child, I would be at home right now. So what if I have to wait another quarter year before I can go on a date with Lightning? If he's truly interested in me and not just after that one thing that Dad has never actually been specific about, then he'll wait for me to grow up a little more. Growling at herself under her breath, Luna turned towards the water, and then turned right back when she heard her companion call out the mental equivalent of a mumbled, Luna. What, she answered, only to realize that he was still asleep. His eyes were still closed, his tongue still peeked from the corner of his mouth, and his breathing was still deep and even. Toothless rolled over, wings moving as though they were hugging something. So hot. Hold you forever. She gasped and stumbled backwards, eyes bugging out in surprise. Holy Dragoness. He's imagining us together. As mates. And then he shifted again, his hips rocking slightly against the sand. Luna. So perfect. His hips twitched once again and then a snore emerged from his mouth. Holy Great Dragon. Her eyes bugged out and he didn't seem quite so harmless and cute anymore. With one glimpse long, gawking look, of his unconscious desires, Toothless had gone from adorable boy dragon to potential mate material. Not that she was looking for a mate or anything, she was still much too young to have children of her own. But the thought had been planted, easily usurping Lightning in her mind, which left her feeling incredibly confused. I thought Lightning was the one for me, but this black dragon is making me rethink everything I ever thought I wanted. Needing to think, and turn off her mind at the same time, Luna bolted for the questionable safety of the ocean to mindlessly chase some fish. It was as she was diving after a rainbow trout that she had a sudden epiphany about what her father meant when he said boys only wanted one thing from females, they wanted to stick their penises inside of girls and mate. Not just form a bonded companionship pair, but mate. The disturbing thought had her looking at Toothless, still sleeping on the beach, with narrow-eyed suspicion. He better keep his snake to himself, or he is going to find himself seriously hurting. The realization that boys weren't quite as safe as she'd assumed them to be was an unwanted shock that she wished she'd received in a somewhat gentler fashion. Surely Mom could have said something. How hard could it be? All it would take would be a, Luna, sweetie, the reason your father doesn't want you to date yet is because boys can't be trusted. They have an unfortunate lack of control of their bodies and will try and hump you at any and all opportunities. Don't turn your back on them. Luna snorted at her own imagination. Surely they're not as bad as all that. But I think I'll keep Toothless at wing's length from now on, just in case. Stars, if I hadn't left home in a snit, I wouldn't be in this situation in the first place. I am such an idiot. Luna turned her frustration on the poor fish, pursuing them with single-minded determination. She was so mad at herself right now. It was her own fault she was lost. Her own fault she spent the night cuddled up beside a strange dragon boy on an island who knew how far away from her home. If her stomach wasn't growling at her like she hadn't eaten for a week, she'd take to the sky this instant and start searching for home. But even in her frustrated state, she knew better than to embark on a possibly very long journey without proper nourishment. It didn't take long for the rush of doing her favorite activity to lull her out of her bad mood. She loved swimming. She loved chasing fish through the ocean. She loved playing with the waves. Her mom had always joked that she'd been born into the wrong class of dragons. Luna sort of agreed with her. Except for the little fact that she was happy she didn't look like a Thunderdrum or Submariner. It may be vain of her, but she liked her sleek, pearlescent body. She happened to believe that Light Furies were the most beautiful of the dragon species and had no rivals for the title. That is, until she met Toothless. There had been stories about a black version of the Light Fury, but no one in her homeland under the sea could remember seeing one. Now that she had to admit the Night Fury was every bit as striking in looks as the Light Fury was. Toothless might be a stranger, a boy with questionable intentions, and maybe a bit younger than her, but he was awfully nice to look at, she'd give him that. As far as his personality was concerned, and whether she would actually like him once she got to know him better. That was a question that she decided it was probably best not to explore further. She should just go home and forget she ever met him. It was better for her mental health anyway. She knew her dad would have a fit and half if he ever found out that she'd actually spent the night cuddled up against him, so she was going to have to be very careful to keep that part of her adventure shielded. And then, as if her musings had called him to her, Toothless appeared beside her in the water with a cheerful greeting and tried to lick her cheek. Upon waking, Toothless found himself alone and possessed of a grumbling empty stomach. "Gah, I'm hungry enough to eat a whale." "Not that I'd ever eat a whale, too blubbery, but maybe a whale's worth of cod or trout would be nice. I wonder what the fishing's like around here." He rose to his feet and stretched, arching his back and spreading out his wings as far as they would go before curling them back up against his body and giving himself a shake to divest himself of the last dregs of sleep. The sun was just rising over the highest part of the island, sending streamers of golden light over the beach and making the ocean sparkle merrily. And bounding through the waves like a streak of moonlight, opalescent scales gleaming in the sun, was an incarnation of the great dragoness herself as Luna fished with angelic grace. His heart thumped like a drum in appreciation and he panted with breath-stealing desire and awe. He watched her dive for fish for a few minutes, sensing her pleasure in the act as she played with the waves more than anything. Oh, stars above! She's so beautiful. I could watch her all day, every day. I might have gotten myself hopelessly lost to do it, but that dragoness right there, she was worth it. Toothless finally shook himself out of his mesmerized stupor and bounded across the sand and then splashed into the ocean with the dragon version of an excited chortle. The cold water had the thankful effect of shocking his hormones into submission, since he'd be very embarrassed if Luna caught him lusting after her. His mother had taught him to respect females, and his father had taught him to keep his male appendage to himself until the female invited him to use it, or he might end up losing it due to a female's wrath. He had no desire to have body parts bitten or slashed off, thank you very much. He shot through the waves to join her with a called out, "Good morning, Luna," and reached out with his nose to give her a good morning lick against her cheek just like he'd seen his parents do 1,000 times. Luna reared her head back like he'd just done something vulgar and gave him a shocked look. "What in the stars are you doing?" she asked suspiciously. He blinked at her in confusion as he paddled in the water to stay afloat, wondering what had changed. "We nuzzled noses yesterday, didn't we? Saying good morning. Haven't you ever heard of the personal space bubble?" she huffed. "Well, yes," he'd admitted. "But I didn't think that applied anymore." Luna rolled her beautiful blue eyes at him and turned her back to him as she scanned the water for a fish to chase, clearly saying she was done with him. He was pretty sure he heard her think, "Idiot," just loud enough that he was convinced she'd meant for him to hear the insult. "Maybe I am. How could I have been so stupid to assume such a beautiful dragoness would just fall for me?" Toothless whimpered softly and watched her dive for a fish before he turned back towards the pale sand beach, his appetite gone. He swam listlessly through the water, letting the waves push him as they wished, eventually hitting the sand with a slump to his shoulders, a droop to his wings, and his head hanging low. Toothless trudged back to the spot they'd slept together in last night and sank back to the sand. He curled up, tucking his head under his wing to block out the sun, and felt sorry for himself. He was lost, and the girl of his dreams that he didn't even know he wanted until he met her had rejected him. Toothless felt like indulging in a pity party was more than appropriate at the moment. Luna was horrified with her behavior. Not because she didn't want him to lick her cheek, but because she did. Unfortunately, she hadn't been very nice about turning him down. And now she felt like pond scum. As she pretended to chase fish, and pretended to ignore him as he swam away like she'd just murdered his family, she cursed herself for being such a mean bitch. But she'd been so surprised at his sudden appearance, and had just finished giving herself a talking to about not letting him get close. And his warm tongue on her cheek had felt so nice. Stars, I'm in such trouble right now. She tried to ignore him as he curled up on the beach in clear dejection. Tried to ignore the voice in her mind that said she should go apologize. Tried to pretend that fishing was the only important thing right now. But the longer she stayed in the water, the more her own words of disdain haunted her. He hadn't deserved that. Perhaps he'd been a little forward and assuming, but he obviously had done it out of the joy of seeing her and not in any way meaning to be pushy or like he was going to jump on her in the next second. Sighing in defeat, Luna gulped down one last fish, and then swam back towards the beach. The sight of him all huddled up in their sleeping spot and radiating pathetic hopelessness made her heart literally hurt in her chest. Well, Gronkle droppings, now I just feel worse. Slinking over to him, she clenched her stomach a couple of times and then regurgitated half of the fish onto the sand in front of him. Toothless unburied his head out from under his wing and blinked at her and then the pile of fresh fish. I'm sorry I was so mean, she thought before she stomped away. Glancing around her, she spotted a nice-looking grassy hill above the beach that looked like a nice spot to soak up some sun before she left to go find her home. As Luna landed on the hill, she studiously ignored the fact that she was stalling and lying to herself about actually wanting to leave Toothless behind. Toothless watched her fly off, making sure she wasn't going far, before he looked at the pile of fish and his appetite came roaring back as his previous joy filled him. She hasn't completely rejected me. Thank you, Great Dragon. Hope filled him again as he slurped up the fish eagerly in less than a minute. Then he looked up at the hill she'd settled on with her back to him and her face turned to the warm summer sun. It was close to the time of year where the sun stayed up all day and all night, so they got a lot of it right now, but it was still cold enough that he could appreciate basking in it as well. Toothless took a minute to close his eyes and feel the warm rays seep past his iridescent black scales and warm him from the inside out, much like his heart felt right now. Wanting to show how much he appreciated her apology, Toothless turned and bounded into the water. She'd given him a present of half her fish, so he thought it was only fitting to return the gesture. It also seemed like the perfect way to earn her affection back. Not that he understood how he'd lost it in the first place, but females were strange creatures sometimes, so it was easier on his peace of mind to not try and overthink it. 15 minutes of super speed fishing later, Toothless was back on the beach. He shook the water off his scales and wings and then flew up to her hill. He regurgitated a pile of fish at her feet and then beamed at her, tongue hanging out the side of his mouth as he panted from his exertions. For you, my beautiful drop of moonlight. Luna turned her head slowly and stared at the fish and then at Toothless. Thank you, but I didn't ask for this and I'm not yours, so get that thought out of your head before you regret it. I'm not in the mood for dealing with you right now. She refused to be swayed by presents and pretty words, no matter how happy and tingly they made her feel. I'm sorry. Toothless slumped a fraction before his eyes lit up as another idea struck him. He raised his wings and started hopping around like a possessed bird, dancing to the beat of the ocean's waves below. Luna gawked at the boy dragon, fairly certain that he'd lost his mind. What in the name of all the stars is that supposed to accomplish? When he hopped within range a minute later, she bopped him on the nose with a paw, careful to keep her claws sheathed. He might be insane, but she didn't want to actually hurt him. What in the frigid depths of the ocean are you doing? Toothless froze, his nose smarting, and then tucked his wings back against his body, hanging his head in embarrassment. "The mating dance," he said tentatively. "It always works for my dad when Mom is mad at him. It makes her laugh every time." Luna snorted. "I imagine it would. I don't know where you got the idea that I'd be interested in a mating dance, ridiculous or otherwise, but I can assure you that I'm most definitely not looking for a mate right now. I'm too young to have children, and Dad would kill me anyway, even if I was interested." Toothless blinked at her as his jaw dropped. I'm way too young to have kids of my own too, so that wasn't my intention. I was just trying to make friends with you and make you happy. That's all. I swear." Luna rolled her eyes at the Black Dragon Boy despite how sweet that was. "While I appreciate the thought, you really need to work on your timing. I'm leaving soon, anyway, so just let it be. I need to find my home. My parents must be sick with worry by now." Toothless hung his head as he realized his own parents must also be very worried. They were used to him flying off and exploring the area around his home island, but he was rarely gone for a whole night. And even if he was, he made sure to get home in time for breakfast. "Mine too," he admitted. He sighed and shuffled away down the hill. "It was nice meeting you, Luna." "Good luck," he thought to her despondently. Luna stared after him, somewhat surprised he was walking away just like that. "Good luck to you too," she called back. "And thank you for the fish," she tacked on. Toothless fluttered his wings at her in a shrugging gesture just before he dropped below her line of sight. Luna sighed and ate the fish, knowing she'd need the nourishment. Then she curled up on the grass and closed her eyes to let the fish digest for a few minutes before she took off. Toothless reached the beach and wandered back to his sleeping spot, plunking his haunches down and curling his tail around his feet as he looked up at Luna's hill. His green eyes were sad and thoughtful as he wondered where he'd gone wrong. He hadn't lied to her, he really hadn't even considered trying to mate with her. All he'd wanted was to win her friendship and see where it went from there. He had just recently reached the age where female dragons had started to look intriguing to him and become sexually mature. After meeting Luna, he knew he'd measure every other dragoness against her. Somehow, he knew they would all come up wanting in comparison. None could ever be as luminescent in color or perfect in form. And when she wasn't being grumpy with him, her personality was wonderful. She was right though, he should just go try and find his family, but he found that he was head over claws infatuated with her and he didn't want to leave her vicinity until was forced to. He also drew hope from the simple fact that she hadn't left yet, either. Surely, if she didn't return my interest, she would have flown away instead of keeping up this pretense of indifference. He shook his head and sighed at his own stupid wishful thinking. He didn't know what had drawn him away from home, but for now, he didn't regret it. Meeting Luna was worth it. And even if she did leave him, perhaps he could seek her out when he was older and she was more receptive to taking on a life mate. How hard could it possibly be to track down a clan of light furies? Spotting a length of driftwood a few steps away, Toothless ambled over to it and picked it up in his teeth. He then proceeded to doodle, using the length of rough wood to dig shallow grooves in the sand. This was something he'd found out he could do by accident years ago. It had soon become a deliberate hobby that made his little brothers giggle when he drew pictures of them or made caricatures of other dragons on the island in silly poses, especially their dad. Smiling around the stick from thinking about his family, and happy with his decision about Luna, the doodles took on a more deliberate focus. A few long squiggled lines reminded him of waves and he was inspired to draw the scene he'd woken up to. Hearing a pleased purr coming from Toothless and strange scratching noises, Luna opened her eyes and turned her head over her shoulder to see what he could possibly be doing now. Her body quickly followed her head and she was suddenly sitting up and staring down at the beach in amazement. Toothless is drawing a picture of me swimming. It was upside down from her angle, but she could easily make out what was being sketched into the sand. Her feet moved of their own accord as she walked down the hill, completely mesmerized by the image taking shape right in front of her. She'd never seen a dragon draw before, but she knew the concept existed because the humans were said to make images on cloth, planks of wood, or thin sheets of tree bark. Luna wandered onto the beach and carefully traversed the edge of the large drawing that was at least twice her real size until she stopped beside Toothless and just admired the picture as he finished her face by making a swoop in the sand to represent her smiling mouth. She couldn't help but wear that expression now as she looked at her picture and then at Toothless. This is amazing. Absolutely amazing. Toothless spit out the stick and grinned widely as he retracted his teeth, demonstrating where his parents had come up with his name. Thank you, Luna. I made it for you so you wouldn't forget me. Luna sucked in a breath. There is absolutely no chance of that ever happening now. Despite how goofy and immature Toothless had seemed at first, it was now blaringly apparent that he was special. He had to be vastly more intelligent than an average dragon to teach himself how to draw, and she was finding him suddenly 10 times more attractive than before. Which had been a lot, if I'm being honest with myself. Lightning completely faded from her mind and Toothless became the only dragon she could ever see herself calling her life mate. Yes, it was a little vain to want the most intelligent dragon in the world for her own and as the father of her future children, but she didn't care. But it wasn't just his talent that had drawn her to him. She hadn't wanted to leave his side even before he'd shown her his artistic skills, so she felt perfectly justified in letting herself claim him here and now. Sorry, Daddy. Growling ever so slightly, Luna pounced on him as his eyes widened in alarm. She knocked him over onto his back and pinned him down with her front feet. What? Shush. The growl faded into a purr and she rubbed her cheek against his, blending their scents. I hereby claim you as my future mate, Toothless Night Fury. Toothless was so astonished at how good it felt to have her weight holding him down and her cheek rubbing against his that it took him a moment to understand the thoughts being sent into his mind. He opened his eyes in shock and met hers, wondering if she was playing a cruel joke on him. The sincerity he saw in her beautiful blue eyes reassured him and he purred in return. I always knew my drawing would be good for something more than making my brothers laugh. He wrapped his front legs around her and reversed their positions so he was now on top of her and he was the one doing the cheek rubbing. I accept your claim, Luna Light Fury. Luna smiled up at him and then pushed him off her so she could rise to her feet. Good. Now we just have to break the news to our parents. I vote we do yours first, since I know my dad won't be happy about this. Maybe your parents can come talk some sense into him. Toothless chuckled as he rolled off the sand and stood, shaking the sand out of his wings. I don't know how happy mine will be about it either, but I'm all for it. Luna gave him a wide, tooth-filled smile. Excellent. She looked up at the sky. Shall we? Toothless nodded once, regally. After you, my moonlit queen. Luna paused as she spread her wings and looked at him. Oh. I like that one. And to be honest, I liked the first one you called me, too. Toothless smirked to himself as he spread his wings and launched off the ground. I'm glad, my breathtaking Luna, because I'm going to shower you with compliments until we're too old to fly and beyond. Luna giggled as they powered up into the sky. I'm holding you to that, my clever Toothless. A few more pictures wouldn't hurt either. I can do that, he thought back eagerly. Now up high in the air, they hovered with slow flaps of their wings as they turned around in circles, looking out across the unfamiliar ocean, and then stared at each in dismay. I hate to ask this, but do you happen to know which way your home is? Because I sure don't, Toothless admitted with a wince. Luna shook her head slowly, eyes wide as the reality of their predicament came crashing back to the forefront of her focus. She'd conveniently forgotten just how lost she'd been when she'd come out of the random days of yesterday. Now, she honestly didn't know what to do. All she knew for sure was that she was beyond happy that she wasn't all alone right now. Toothless sucked in a big breath and forced himself to concentrate. Okay. Logically, I should be able to figure this out. When I left home the sun was in the second half of its trip across the sky and I flew away from it. The sun is currently in its rising pattern, which means that to get home, I should fly away from it again. With any luck, we'll eventually encounter an island I'm familiar with and then we'll soon be at my home. Luna flew a little closer and rubbed her head against his neck. You continue to impress me with how smart you are. You keep this up and I think I'll fall in love with you. Toothless grinned at her and nudged her fondly. Then I shall strive to continue to be your clever Night Fury with the utmost dedication because you have some catching up to do in the falling in love department. Luna giggled as she chased after him as he flew away from the eastern sun. You aren't seriously admitting that you love me already? We've only known each other for half a day. Toothless flew a circle around her with a few joyful flaps of his wings. "That's exactly what I'm saying. I liked you last night, but when I saw you play in the ocean, you caught my heart. I've never seen such pure joy and grace in a dragoness. And your unique beauty doesn't hurt either. Oh. Oh my. Thank you." Luna was essentially speechless at his confession. She had a feeling she would never regret picking Toothless as her future mate no matter what her daddy said, whenever she did manage to get home. Watching the black dragon fly with graceful ease around her hovering position, warmth filled her from muzzle to tail fins. "I think, getting lost might just be the best thing to ever happen to me." A few hours of dedicated flight to the west, the sun was just beginning to rise on Night Fury Island, but Toothless' family was already wide awake. His parents hadn't slept well, plagued with worry for their son. Longwing gave his mate a reassuring lick on her cheek despite his bad feeling. "I'm just going to go for a quick flight of the area. I'm sure he's fine and we'll be back in no time." Ebony sighed. "I hope so, dear. I really hope so." She gathered Spin and Fin under her wings and they watched as Longwing took off for the nearest island, a 2-minute flight to the south. "Please bring them home safe," she prayed to the great dragon in the sky. "Please." Ebony had never felt so worried about Toothless before, not even the first time he'd disappeared on his first adventure. There was a sinking feeling in her gut that just wouldn't leave her alone. Pushing the worry to the side for the moment, Ebony smiled at her young twins. "Come on, boys. Let's go fish up some breakfast for your father and brother for when they get back." "Yes, Mom," they replied in unison, little wings flying after her much bigger form as she took off for the fishing cove. 4 hours later, Longwing's voice was hoarse from calling for Toothless and his wings were starting to get tired. He'd flown ever-expanding circles around his home island and he wasn't sure how much further he'd go before he lost his sense of where home was. He was just about to give up for the morning and go report back to Ebony when he spotted another island in the distance. Finding a new surge of energy, Longwing picked up his speed and flew for the island, once again calling for Toothless. Toothless didn't answer, but his sensitive ears did catch the sound of something calling back. Sort of. He rounded a corner of the island and found a human longship docked in the small harbor. On the boat, multiple hairy humans were exclaiming as they looked up at him with pointing appendages. Longwing hovered in the air with great flaps of his wings as he studied the boat carefully, sending out a loud mental call for Toothless one more time, just in case the humans had captured him. But he didn't sense his son in any fashion. Not by smell or sight or sound. Feeling defeated, Longwing turned around and flew for home at a fraction of his maximum speed, reluctant to return to his mate and tell her that he'd failed. He could only hope that he'd somehow missed Toothless and that his son would already be home and waiting for him when he got there. Unfortunately, his thoughts were too worried and preoccupied to notice that the longship followed him. Chapter 5, New Homes. Chapter text. New Homes. The newly affianced couple had only been in flight for 10 minutes when they heard the mesmerizing call again. Toothless and Luna barely had time to think, "No, not Erg," before their eyes glazed over and they swooped around in a half-circle and flew back towards the sun. Half an hour later, they flew into a thick bank of fog. Enshrouded by the fog was a fearsome tower of an island with glowing cracks of red throughout the rocky mountain. The island reeked of sulfur and death. The feeling in the air cried of fear and forced obedience. It was a miserable place. And it was home to the Red Death. The massive Titan-class Dragon Queen was bigger than a whole fleet of longships, uglier than a flock of wart-covered gronkles, and scarier than a village full of females PMsing at the same time. She lived in the fiery magma depths of the volcano at the center of the island, making her nearly invulnerable to attack. She demanded obedience and offerings of sustenance from the dragons caught in her siren call. And they obeyed. Toothless and Luna were no exception. Like the mindless drones of a queen bee, they joined a long line of assorted dragons flying through a cave system. It was at this point that Toothless finally shook off the hypnotic call and came back to himself. He never did understand completely how that happened, but the sound of so many wings flapping in such tight quarters made the subsonic tone of the Red Death's call little more than a background buzz that his stubborn willpower was able to overthrow. He looked around him with wide, panicky eyes, confused as to what was happening. Dragons. So many dragons. I've never seen so many different kinds in one place before. And where am I? And where's Luna? 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 Where are you? He called, head swiveling back and forth, looking for her frantically. He tried to stop, but there was no room and the other dragons flew into him, battering him with their wings mercilessly, uncaring about anything but following the voice that demanded all of their attention. With little choice, he continued to fly along with the crowd, but kept to the edge as much as possible and slowed down as much as he dared until a white dragoness flew past him. Nearly sagging with relief, Toothless quickly caught up. Luna. When she didn't respond with so much as a glance from her blank eyes, Toothless tried again, nudging into her shoulder and whimpering a little. Luna. Please, Luna, wake up. Still nothing. He nudged her harder and practically shouted into her mind while roaring in her ears. Luna. Luna shook her head as if trying to shake the noise out of her mind and finally looked around her with dawning clarity. For a moment, she wore the same look of confused horror that Toothless had, until she saw him flying beside her. Toothless. What's happening? Where are we? I don't know, he had to admit. But I think we're about to find out, he added as the cave opened up into a giant cavern that smelled terrible and was degrees warmer than comfortable. They settled onto the ledge of the opening as they watched dragon after dragon drop an animal or regurgitate a belly full of fish into what appeared to be the steam of the magma at the bottom of the cavern. But Toothless knew better. He'd heard about queens from his mother, but had never encountered one, living on Night Fury Island all his life. The closest thing they had to a queen was Midnight, an ancient dragoness that had lived so long, she had great-great-grandchildren on the island. Toothless being one of them. She was treated with the greatest respect and food was brought to her, but not because she demanded it but because she simply couldn't fly anymore and her extended family cared about her well-being. This queen, wherever she was in the depths of the volcano, was not someone to respect, but someone to fear. Toothless now understood how he'd become lost. Even if her call wasn't what he'd first heard that had inspired him to leave home, it was what had summoned him to this area of the world. And if she'd done it once, she could do it again. Toothless shared his thoughts with Luna in a quick burst, and then added on, we need to get out of here. Now. I totally agree, Luna said just as a mighty roar filled the cavern. Droves of dragons dove into alcoves and quivered on rock ledges, trying to disappear. Great dragon, I think she heard us, Toothless thought, gulping in fear. The Furies froze halfway in the act of retreating as the Queen's willpower took over their bodies with impertinence quelling force. Against their will, they faced the center of the cavern again as a dark grey dragon covered in small red spikes, and nearly as big as the hollow mountain it resided under rose up out of the mist. 6 piercing eyes pinned them to the ledge they were standing on. You think to escape me? A booming female voice echoed through their minds as she roared at them again with a cloud of fetid breath, making them wince, eyes stinging from the putrid stench of rotting fish and sulfur. I think not, my pretty new minions. Toothless and Luna were forced to their knees by her will, bowing before her. He could barely breathe from the pressure nearly crushing his brain and body into submission. You will nest nearby and you will provide me with food every day or I will kill you. Do you understand? Luna trembled beside him, tears leaking from her eyes from the pain. She whimpered as she nodded once. Toothless was hardly any better, but his pride wouldn't let him cry. We understand, Your Highness. We will do as you command. He didn't know what he'd do now about finding his family, but Toothless couldn't take the chance of risking Luna's life by disobeying the Queen. Good, roared the Queen, both mentally and out loud. The cavern shook and the thousands of dragons within huddled even further into the rock walls. Now feed me your pathetic offerings and you may go. And for future reference, I prefer animals over fish, so you better bring me something with legs at least every second day. Yes, my Queen, Toothless and Luna said together, their tones more subdued than either of the strong-willed dragons had ever uttered. The pressure eased off their minds and bones as she opened her massive mouth and waited. Toothless gulped and looked at Luna. She sniffled but stiffened her muscles with resolve. Come on, Toothless. We can always get more fish. And with that, Luna flew off the ledge and towards the waiting mouth filled with teeth bigger than her. Not to be outdone by the courageous dragoness, Toothless followed. They regurgitated their fish into the waiting mouth, in danger of passing out from the smell of the Queen's breath as they did so. As they turned to fly away, the queen surged up and closed her mouth with a snap that just barely avoided taking off the ends of their tails. Toothless shuddered in shock and fear and flew faster as the most spine-chilling laughter he'd ever heard, or would ever hear, reverberated through his mind. They zipped back through the cave, not speaking a word because they were too stunned at the turn of events to do so. With numb minds and faintly trembling limbs, they flew back to their little island out of sheer instinct and landed on the grass hill with trembling legs. Toothless sank to his haunches and Luna did the same directly beside him. She leaned into him and he leaned right back, drawing support from each other, needing it desperately. "What are we going to do now?" Luna whispered forlornly, finally breaking the silence. Toothless sucked in a shuddering breath before answering. "I guess we make this our home for now. We can't fly away or she'll draw us back. She must let us go searching for animals, though, or she'd never get any." Luna snuggled even closer into his side and he raised a wing and settled it over her. "I don't like this. I want to go home. I want my parents." Toothless looked off across the ocean in the direction he was fairly certain his family was, an overwhelming wave of homesickness forcing his breaths out in two quick pants of emotional pain. "Me too, Luna. Me too. At least we're not alone." Toothless turned his gaze to the white dragoness, seeing a glistening tear leak from her eye. He licked up the droplet as it slowly traversed the fine scales of her cheek and his own distress faded as he realized that together, they could face anything. "Yes. At least we're not alone. We have each other. And I promise, you will always have me at your side for as long as you want me." Luna looked back at the midnight-colored dragon, and felt herself calm at the quiet assurance in his tone. In that moment, she fell in love with him as they formed an unbreakable bond of trust and loyalty. "I will always want you at my side, Toothless. And I will always stand by yours." She licked his cheek to seal the deal and then bounced back onto her feet, wings unfurling as a playful breeze tickled her scales. "Now let's go get some more fish. I'm hungry." The young Night Fury watched her glide down the hill, eyes blinking with awe and astonishment, not only at her abrupt mood change, but also at the unspoken glimpse of her emotions that she'd let him feel. I think she just admitted to loving me back. By the great dragon, she already loves me back. Yes." The excitement of the moment had him clumsily dashing after her like a baby dragon first learning to fly. He didn't care. He was going to go fishing with the new love of his life and the rest of their problems would sort themselves out later. 6 days later, not too far from Night Fury Island. A brown stork flew through the clouds with easy flaps of his 4 mighty wings, following a small fleet of 5 longships. On his back, a standing rider dressed in brown and turquoise leather armor and a spike-horn-covered mask, a red cape, and carrying a staff with carved bone hooks at both ends balanced easily on the flying dragon. Valka peered through a spyglass at the longship in the lead, frowning at the white-haired man dressed in shimmery black leather from the neck down. Despite the color of his hair, the man wasn't old. He looked to be in his prime and was fit almost to the point of being slender. She also got the impression he was far from a typical Viking, even though the rest of his crew appeared to be. This man is too well groomed and carries himself too well to be anything like an average, thick-muscled and equally thick-brained Viking male. I don't like him. His men were armed to the teeth and looked suspiciously familiar, making her think they were actually Drago's henchmen. She'd spent too many years rescuing dragons from Drago's evil grasp to not recognize at least a few of them. And now that she looked, the longship's shields and sails were covered in Drago's symbol of a sword through a dragon head, and the decks were lined with the usual assortment of evil dragon-catching paraphernalia. Whoever this man was, he was new, but he'd somehow earned Drago's trust enough to command a small fraction of the warlord's army. She wasn't sure how that had happened, though, considered the warlord was roughly 4 times this man's size in breadth and was notoriously suspicious of possible usurpers to his position as the dragon god. I have a bad feeling about this, she murmured to Cloudjumper as she tucked the spyglass into a pouch on her belt. I agree, Cloudjumper thought back, a subtle growl coming from his throat that rumbled up into her feet. Let's get ahead of them and see if we can find what they're hunting. Gladly. Valka reached forward and grasped a spike on the back of her dragon's head just in time to avoid being blown off by the sudden gust of wind as he accelerated to a breathtaking speed. They left the longships behind in moments. Gods, I love flying. It never gets old, she thought as adrenaline coursed through her veins, and exultant, feminine laughter filled the clouds. Her dragon echoed her laughter in a deep, rumbling bass, deliberately aiming for the thickest clouds to fly through, just for the fun of it. By staying on the same trajectory as the longships, it didn't take them long to find the dragon hunter's objective. Cloudjumper circled the island from afar as Valka pulled out her spyglass again. She gasped as she caught sight of the black dragons that inhabited the mountainous island. Are those Night Furies? Yes. I thought they were just a myth, Valka nearly whispered in awe. Not a myth, Cloudjumper chuckled. But they are rare. I have only ever seen one, and that was many years ago. A whole clan of them is almost unheard of. Let's see if we can prevent them from becoming even rarer, she said with determination, lacing her tone as she tucked her spyglass away again. There is no way I'm letting that white-haired snake of a man and Drago's goons capture or kill these magnificent creatures. As you wish. Cloudjumper swooped down towards the island, instantly catching the attention of more than one Night Fury. A cry rang through the air, and within moments every adult dragon was winging towards Cloudjumper, and the young were told to go hide. Cloudjumper landed on the beach, dwarfing the Night Furies that landed in a semicircle in front of him and regarded him with guarded suspicion. Some even growled as they noticed that Cloudjumper was carrying a human passenger. A big male Night Fury stepped forward from the front of the group and faced the bigger dragon with a confident stance. "Who are you and why have you brought a human to our island?" he demanded of Cloudjumper. Cloudjumper stared down the leader and the group of about 20 black dragons with calm authority. "I am Cloudjumper, and this is my human, Valka. She is a good human, not like the others. We come to warn you of danger. A pack of the bad kind of humans will be here within the hour. They come to hunt you and kill you for your hides, or enslave you and force you to be little better than attack dogs. If you do not want this fate, you need to leave this island. Now." The leader quelled exclamations of alarm from his flock with a look before he turned back to the bigger dragon. "Why should we trust your word? You carry a human. It could be making you say these things." Cloudjumper snorted in dry amusement. "As if a paltry human could ever tame and enslave me. Does my will seem overtaken to you? Valka is my friend. We work together to free dragons from the humans coming your way. We only mean to help you and bring you to a place of safety." To prove his words, he blasted the whole clan of Furies with an image of the longship fleet along with past memories of dragons in cages, starving and tortured. He also threw in a picture of the white-haired human dressed in black armor that looked an awful lot like the scaly hides of these Night Furies. That got the gasps he was looking for. The leader was clearly undecided as he looked from Cloudjumper to his clan and back again. "I think we should do what he says," Longwing, a female dragon, said as she came to stand beside the leader. "Think of the children." Longwing sighed. "I am thinking of the children, Ebony. But what about Toothless? What if he comes back and we're gone? And what about Midnight? She can't fly anymore. And the eggs, it's not safe to move them if we don't have to." "If it helps," Cloudjumper said after shamelessly eavesdropping on their silent conversation, "I don't know what to say about your missing dragon, but I can carry your dragoness. And as far as your eggs are concerned, they'll have a better chance of survival being moved than staying here. You do not want to know what happens to the spirits of young dragons raised in captivity." Longwing hung his head and closed his eyes as he made a hard decision for the good of the clan, no matter how much it hurt to think of Toothless coming home and finding everyone gone. "Maybe I can come back periodically to see if my son has come back." That thought helped settle the decision in his mind. Longwing looked up at the big brown Storacutter. "All right. We'll leave. I am trusting you on this. Do not make me regret it." Cloudjumper nodded once. "You will not. You'll like Sanctuary. Or at least, I'm sure your young will. There are many young dragons there for them to play with." "Oh joy," Ebony said with a roll of her eyes. "More young dragons to try and keep out of trouble." Longwing chuckled after his mate as she flew off to retrieve the twins, along with a handful of other dragons that went to get their children or their eggs. He looked over his shoulder at Cloudjumper as he turned away. "Come on then, and I'll take you to Midnight. The old girl might actually enjoy this. It's been years since she flew. Then I am doubly glad to help." No dragon deserves to be grounded. Flying is our life. Cloudjumper said as he followed the Night Fury towards the center of the island. Meanwhile, Valka had nearly been vibrating with curiosity, dying to know what was happening with the dragons. Unlike Cloudjumper, she couldn't eavesdrop on mental conversations unless they were specifically broadcast to her, and then it wasn't really eavesdropping, was it? "What's happening?" she said quietly as they flew across the island. "They are coming with us. I am going to carry an old dragoness that can no longer fly." "Ah. Good. That's good," Valka said with a relieved smile. "I hope our bewilderbeast doesn't mind the addition of another flock so soon after the last batch we rescued. I doubt that will be a problem. Falker is a generous king. But perhaps I should have told the Night Furies that they are going to have to become his loyal subjects in order to live in Sanctuary. It appears this flock is unaffiliated with a queen or king and they might not like the slight change in lifestyle. I think, in this case, it is better to explain after we get there. There is no time for any second guessing." "I agree," Cloudjumper thought as they came in for a landing on a big, moss-covered ledge on the side of a mountain. "We'll tell them later." He bowed to the ancient dragoness that toddled forward to meet them, cloudy green eyes wide with curiosity. She looked much too old to still be alive, with tattered wings and scales turned to grey around the face. "Hello, my lady. I am here to give you a ride to your new home." 2 weeks later, unnamed island. Toothless landed on the beach, calling for his girlfriend, excitement thrumming through his veins. "Luna. Luna." Luna emerged from the ocean where she'd been diving for fish and quickly swam over to the beach, shaking off the water when she made it to land. "What is it, Toothless?" He bounded over to her, radiating his excitement. He touched his nose to hers briefly in a warm hello after not seeing her for a whole day before giving her his news. "As you know, I followed a deadly nadder that was bringing the queen a furry animal on a regular basis that she likes the best, wondering where he was getting the sheep and yak from." "Yes. And you'll never guess what I found." Toothless was practically bouncing with the energy filling him. "What? What did you find? It's amazing. And perfect." Luna was about ready to smack him upside the head for not actually giving her a real answer. "What was perfect, Toothless?" she said, holding on to her patience out of determination alone. "A hidden cove. It has a lake with fish, a waterfall, is surrounded by rock walls, is almost inaccessible to anything that can't fly, and has a nice network of caves to spend the winter in. And best of all, no one else lives there. Oh. And even better than that, it's on the same island the furry animals come from. Feeding the queen will be easy." "It does sound perfect," Luna admitted. Their current island was fine for the summer, but it offered very little in the way of protection from the winter elements. Even fire-breathing dragons preferred to stay out of the cold if they could. She narrowed her eyes at Toothless as she realized the cove sounded just a little bit too perfect. If it is such a find, why aren't other dragons living there? "All right. Spill. There has to be something on the downside you're not telling me." Toothless looked down at his toes when he couldn't meet her suspicious gaze anymore. She was too smart sometimes. Not that he'd want a stupid mate, but still. There's a herd of humans living on the island too. It's their animals the deadly nadder has been stealing. Luna gawked at him for a few seconds, jaw actually dropping a bit. "Let me get this straight. You want us to live on an island already occupied by the dragon killing humans and steal their animals? Are you out of your mind?" Toothless flinched at the mental screech. He glanced up at her disbelieving blue eyes before studying the individual grains of sand under his paws again. "Yes. And no, I think it's a perfectly feasible idea. They have patrols constantly scanning for dragons coming in from the ocean and weapons that are worthy of respect. But if we already lived there, we wouldn't have to worry about that. We can snatch an animal in the dead of night while the humans are sleeping. One of the caves lets out onto a cliff face just above the ocean. We can swim in unseen every time we come back from feeding the queen." Luna sucked in a deep breath and carefully thought through everything he'd said. Perhaps he was right and this might just work. "All right, Toothless. Show me this cove of yours. I'm willing to give it a shot, at least." Toothless finally looked up and grinned widely at her before pouncing on her and licking her face enthusiastically. Thank you, thank you. You won't regret it, I promise. You'll love it there, it's so pretty. There's even some sand to make pictures in. All right, she laughed as she licked him back once and then pushed him off her. You've convinced me. She stood and shook off the sand and then nudged her cheek against his when he'd done the same. Come on, my persuasive one, let's go brave the land of the humans. Chapter 6, Misunderstandings. Chapter text. Misunderstandings. 14 years. Hiccup was quickly coming to the conclusion that this might be the worst year of his life. And that falling in love with the prettiest girl on the island was possibly the stupidest thing he'd ever done. Not only did it make maintaining their friendship without giving himself away ridiculously hard, he also now had to watch every unattached male, and some of the attached ones too, under the age of 20 fawn all over her and make complete asses of themselves as they fought with each other to impress her with their prowess. At the moment, Hiccup was in his loft room, at his desk, doodling sketches of Astrid and thinking of all the depressing reasons she would never return his affection. 1. Astrid would want a real man as her husband, one who could fight the dragons and protect their children. Despite their secret training, Hiccup was almost positive he'd never be approved to go to the Dragon Academy next year when it ran again. And thus, he'd never be considered a real Viking. 2. Astrid could do so much better than him when it came to physical appearance. Hiccup thought of himself as only passably okay looking with stupid, untameable hair that looked awful if he let it grow long and only somewhat better when it was short. He was also now shorter than her by a good hand's width, since she'd had a final growth spurt and he hadn't. In fact, Hiccup was petrified he'd never grow again, and be stuck at child height forever. 3. By the time Hiccup did catch up to her in height and, please, filled out a bit so he didn't rival a twig for the skinniest thing on the island, he just knew that Astrid would have picked another boy for her husband. Hiccup could even take a good guess as to who it would be, one Ilof the Lucky. The 16-year-old was the star of last year's Dragon School, had the blonde and blue-eyed looks of Thor, and the build to match. The only thing Ilof was missing was a high degree of intelligence, but with his looks and fighting skills, who cared? Hiccup sighed and traced a finger over the outline of Astrid's braid in a sketch where it was flying out behind her as she whirled on the ball of her foot, axe just 1 second away from being released in a throw. She was so magnificent, so beautiful, he knew his drawings didn't do her justice, but he couldn't help drawing more and more of them. Unable to help himself, Hiccup flipped to the second last picture in the messy pile and uncovered his favorite guilty pleasure, a sketch of Astrid wearing nothing but her hair as she lay on her front, chin propped on her crossed arms and a dreamy look in her eyes. Gods, he'd felt like a pervert when he drew it, and half of it was guesswork, but it was just so hot, he couldn't make himself burn it. Nor could he stop himself from imagining it, her, naked and kissing him, her long, glorious, golden locks surrounding them, as he dreamed of unlikely scenarios in the dark of night. Now, his fingers traced the line of her hair as it followed the dip of her back and the rise of her bottom. He sighed softly again in longing, wishing he could bury his face in the back of her neck and just breathe her in before pushing her hair to the side and running kisses down the length of her spine. Hiccup. Shit. He jumped guiltily at his father's bellow coming from the base of the stairs, shaking fingers scrambling to bury the naughty drawing and the other Astrids amongst the sketches of fanciful inventions. Thor, it felt like he was yelling at me for ogling, but it had to just be a coincidence. Right. Yes, Dad, he called back, wincing when his voice cracked. He jumped up from his chair and moved to look down at his father from the top of the stairs before Stoic could get the idea to come up to his room. I'm going to hang out with Gobber and the guys at the pub for dinner tonight, Stoic explained, looking up at him with an expectant expression, so Hiccup started down the stairs. Are you going to be okay rummaging for yourself? Hiccup restrained the urge to roll his eyes at that. He'd been left on his own more often than not and was easily the better cook of the two of them. And his father knew it, he just liked to conveniently forget on a regular basis. Yes, Dad, I'll be fine. I might go to Astrid's for dinner, anyway, he tacked on as he stopped on the bottom step, now looking way up at his massive father who still topped him even with a temporary height advantage. Stoic's mouth quirked up in a smile under his moustache as he clapped a hand bigger than Hiccup's entire head on his scrawny shoulder, nearly making the boy's knees buckle. Good. Good. He steered Hiccup towards the door as he walked that way, practically carrying him without even realizing it. You know, I wouldn't be opposed to adding that girl to our family. Quite the little warrior she's turning out to be, he said with a twinkle in his eyes and a wiggle of his thick brows. You really need to get a move on and win her already before someone else does. What the hell? Is he seriously encouraging me to go courting? Hiccup somehow dragged them to a stop and gawked at his father for a second before exploding. Dad. That's just. How could you think? What in Thor's name gave you the idea that I even like her like that? And even if I did, which I'm not saying I do, I don't stand a chance against the likes of Ilof the Lucky. Stoic gave his son a puzzled look. What? What's wrong with you? You look fine to me. You're the son of the chief, have the famous haddock good looks, are a mighty fine blacksmith, and have enough smarts for 3 Vikings put together. You should be beating the girls off with a stick. Stoic adopted a smug look. I know I was, at your age. The teenage Viking practically growled as he felt years' worth of contained temper boil over at his father's blatant obliviousness to his situation. You don't have a clue, do you? There are no girls. And there will probably never be any girls. I'm short, scrawny, and forbidden to learn how to fight dragons. I'm the laughing stock of the island. No girl is ever going to want that for a husband. Stoic reared back as if he'd been punched. I see. His green eyes welled with sorrow as he looked down at his son and noticed just how short he was still for his age. But he's always been just my wee Hiccup, hasn't he? I can't make you taller or bigger, and I can't give you permission to go to dragon school next year. You'll never survive it, and I just can't lose you too. You're all I have left. And that's why I should have kept my stupid mouth shut in the first place. Hiccup sagged on his feet, shoulders drooping, as his temper fizzled out and died under the familiar guilt trip. I know, Dad. I'm sorry I even brought it up. He opened the door. Go. Go have fun with your friends. I'll see you in the morning. Stoic studied his son, looking defeated and smaller than ever, finally realizing that he might have done wrong by him, but not quite willing to take the step that would fix it. All right, son. Just try to think about what you do have going for you, okay? You'll grow eventually, I'm sure, and there will be other girls if your friend can't see what's right in front of her. There are no other girls but Astrid as far as I'm concerned. But Hiccup kept that thought to himself and only scoffed lightly as he pushed his father out the door. Thanks, Dad, for the pep talk, he said, only mostly sarcastic. I'll go right over to Astrid's and confess my undying love. Ha! Never in a million years, he added in his head. I have no desire to ruin our friendship or be laughed right out of her house. Now go, before the others drink all the beer before you get there. Stoic smiled and ruffled Hiccup's hair. That's the spirit, son. He grabbed Hiccup and pulled him out the door too before closing it with a hearty slam. I'll walk you to the Horferson house and pick up Hector if he hasn't left already. Hiccup swallowed a groan. He'd totally been lying about going to Astrid's, not currently in the mood to deal with all the emotional drama that came with being in her presence, which had been increasingly difficult lately, no matter how much he loved spending time with her. But now it seemed he didn't have a choice. If he could just convince his body not to react to her alluring scent, or how the light shone on her golden hair, or her sweet and commanding voice, or the enticing curve of her hips, or any of the 100 other things that so easily turned him on, it wouldn't be so bad. He snorted mentally. As if his wayward hormones absolutely adored Astrid and were determined to show it at all times. Which is why his tunics had gotten longer lately and he'd taken to wearing a long, thick fur vest, even in the month that passed as summer in the archipelago. The trip down the mountainside went much too quickly and not quickly enough, as Hiccup had to listen to his father go on and on with forced cheerfulness about his courting days as a young man. It had just started to transition from uncomfortable to interesting when he mentioned the first time he met his mother at a tribe gathering, but then they arrived at the Horferson house and that monologue screeched to a stop. Hiccup almost wanted to turn around and make the trip again so his father would say more about his mother, because he hardly ever talked about her, and Hiccup was always eager for any little tidbits he did learn about her. But that wasn't to be. At least, not today. Stoic gave the Horferson door a hearty knock, grinning when it was finally opened by Alga. She didn't give Stoic time to even ask, already knowing what he wanted. Hector's already left for the pub, Stoic. Oh. Good, he grunted before turning right back around. Have a good evening, Alga, hiccup, he yelled over his shoulder, eager steps striding down the street. The tall, blonde, beautiful, and relatively lean for a Vikingis woman focused on hiccup and smiled gently. Astrid already left for your house. You must have missed her somewhere. Hiccup gave the female who was the closest thing to a mother he had a grateful smile. Thanks. I'll go find her. Despite the conundrum of having to deal with rampaging hormones whenever he was within a few meters of Astrid, he couldn't help but feel a thrill of delight that put a bounce in his step as he climbed back up the mountain. Anytime Astrid chose to spend her evenings with him always made him feel like the luckiest boy in the world, even if it was just to make yet another attempt at turning Hiccup into something resembling a warrior on the sly. Hiccup was all for the sword and battle axe training, he just wasn't particularly good at it. Perhaps because he knew it was akin to whipping a dead yak, since he knew he'd never be allowed to go dragon hunting, that he just couldn't focus enough to even come close to beating Astrid at her forte. Or maybe it was because he'd rather watch her than fight her. The one thing he had mastered over the years, though, and much to Astrid's delight, was knife throwing. The challenge of refining such a delicate skill had intrigued him from the start, and he could actually give Astrid a run for her money when they had a friendly competition. He even won a good 40% of the time. Reaching his house, he expected to find Astrid leaning against the wall, waiting for him, or even inside, since there was a bit of chill in the early autumn air. But she wasn't there. So Hiccup continued on past his house and over the bridge that linked the village part of the island with the big center section of the Isle of Berk. Up here, aside from the livestock pastures, there was also the training grounds and the dragon arena. Neither Hiccup nor Astrid had been inside the dragon arena, since only the older teenagers were allowed inside during their dragon training, and it was kept locked up tight the rest of the time. But he'd seen it from the stands that circled the outside and found it awe-inspiring and intimidating. Hiccup had to wonder if he'd ever see the view from the inside, looking up. At the moment, he very much doubted it. At least Astrid will next summer, when it's her turn to take the dragon training. She's so going to be the star of that group of teenagers, he thought smugly. Snotlout, Rough Nut, Tough Nut, and Fishlegs didn't stand a chance of being the first chosen by Gothai to fight the monstrous nightmare that equaled graduating to true Viking status, not against the truly magnificent Vikingis, Astrid Horfason. Hiccup was both anticipating and dreading that fight. He knew she'd be spectacular, but at the same time, he was sure he wouldn't breathe for the whole thing, as he lived in terror that something might go wrong. In this instance, he could understand where his father's overprotective streak was coming from. He didn't like it, but he could understand it. Hiccup finally made it up to the clearing designated for sparring and came to an abrupt halt as his eyes scanned the space, his heart breaking even though he knew this day was coming. Oh gods! Oh gods! Oh gods! I think I'm going to be sick. Or die. Or both. To the left side of the clearing, pressed up against a boulder, Astrid had her mouth plastered to Ilof's and her hands were buried in his long hair as he bent over her much smaller form, his hands against the rock on either side of her head. Hearing a moan from one of them spurred Hiccup's frozen and faintly trembling body into moving again. Swallowing down the bile lurking in his throat, he spun right back around and ran all the way back to his house, his heart feeling literally stabbed from the pain of what he'd just witnessed. He flung open the door and slammed it as hard as he could behind him, taking great comfort in the physical act, then ran up the stairs to his room where he flung himself face down on his bed by the window. His narrow shoulders shook with the effort it took to hold in the pathetic sobs that wanted to escape as he hugged his pillow for dear life. Gods, he wanted to scream and wail at the injustice of it all, but at the same time, he was quietly accepting. Because he'd known she would fall for some other boy soon enough. Honestly, he was surprised it had taken her this long to give in to all the attention she'd been receiving lately. Then again, maybe this wasn't a new thing, and she'd just been keeping her relationship with Ilof quiet for some reason. Maybe so she didn't hurt my feelings. That thought was somewhat comforting, but it didn't help much. Hiccup rolled over onto his back, still hugging his pillow for comfort, and stared up at the ceiling that was sort of glowing with the reflected light of the lowering sun, a single glistening tear rolling down his cheek to fall uncomfortably into his ear. Unrequited love sucks. Half an hour prior, Astrid left her house right after her dad did, and made straight for the sparring clearing in search of the silver skull that had fallen off her belt. She hadn't noticed it was missing until her mom pointed it out, since it was one of the back ones, but now felt terrible about it. She refused to actually lose it, because Hiccup had made her the belt as a Snoggletop gift last year and she loved it dearly. It was just so, he was good like that, knowing what she'd like. She knew Hiccup would happily make a new skull to replace the missing one, but they were made of silver and that particular metal wasn't the easiest to come by. She had no idea how he'd found or bartered for the silver to make the ornaments she did have, but she really appreciated the effort and cost of it. Odin knew, it only made her love him more. Was there a sweeter or smarter boy on the island? Not even close. Astrid was distracted enough in her worry and thoughts that she didn't notice Elof moving up to walk beside her until she was almost out of the main part of the village and he spoke. "Whatcha doing, Thor?" Astrid nearly jumped out of her skin from the unexpected sound of the husky voice beside her, but refused to show it. She glanced up at Elof with a cool and indifferent expression as her heartbeat settled back down to normal. "Oh. Hi, Elof. I was just going to go look for something up in the sparring yard. I lost one of my skulls." Elof gave her his usual perfect smile, filled with nice straight teeth and tinged with hope. "I can help ya look if ya want. I'm not doing nothing." Astrid was about to turn him down when she thought better of it. Two sets of eyes are better than one, as they say. And finding the skull was really important to her. "Sure, I guess." She tried to keep her tone as discouraging as possible, not wanting the pushy oaf to get any ideas. Elof lit up and then his look turned kind of smoldering as they walked. How does he not get it that I'm not interested?" Astrid picked up the pace to put as much distance as possible between them. Ever since she'd grown a pair of breasts, the boys had come to the very annoying conclusion that she was now dying for their attentions. As far as she could tell, with the sole exception of Hiccup, the young males of her species were possessed of wandering hands and one-track minds. It was bloody annoying. She'd already turned down more offers of one-on-one sparring sessions than there were livestock in the fields. And, she'd had to flat out refuse 5 proposals of marriage already, saying she wasn't ready to marry anyone yet, just to be sort of nice. 2 of which were from Snotlout. At this rate, though, her refusals were going to start sounding more like, "Never in a million years, you moron," because she was quickly getting fed up with the whole thing. Astrid supposed that if Hiccup didn't exist, then she'd probably have said yes to Fishleg's car-fied proposal, since he was the least loathsome of the lot, being decent enough to look at, smart, kind, and turning into a half-decent warrior with her help. The 2 guys she would never say yes to, even if they were the last men on earth, were Snotlout and Elof. One was obnoxious to the extreme, and the other was a lust-driven beast who was nearly as dumb as a yak and couldn't hold an interesting conversation that didn't involve recapping his latest dragon kill into infinitum to save his life. She'd thanked Thor about 1,000 times already for the refreshing gift that was Hiccup, even if the boy was being obtuse about figuring out that she was a girl. It was ironic really, considering that she wished all of the other boys would forget that little facet about her and treat her like one of them instead of all this groping nonsense. Not that she believed Hiccup would ever be so ungentlemanly as to actually grope a person, but at this point, she wouldn't mind if he did, just so she knew that he returned her interest. The walk up to the training grounds went fast enough, with Astrid lost in her thoughts and making generic, UN hus when necessary to Elof's latest speech about the greatness that was him. She was more relieved than she could possibly express in words when they finally arrived and could direct Elof to start looking before they ran out of daylight. She also very deliberately sent him to the other side of the grass-covered space so she didn't have to listen to him jabber on anymore. Astrid had nearly covered the entirety of her half of the sparring grounds and was now walking along the edge when Elof ran over, looking triumphant. "I found it, Astrid," he called, holding out the small silver skull triumphantly as he skidded to a stop in front of her. "That's great, Elof. Thank you so much," she gushed in relief as she reached for it. The pain in the ass who believed himself to be Thor's gift to womankind held the skull up higher than she could reach, a lustful cast taking over his features. What do I get for finding this for you?" The blonde Vikingess wished she could say, "A swift kick to the nuts," but she'd tried that with him before, and he'd just thought she was coming on to him. The meathead had a ridiculously high pain tolerance, and as far as she could tell, liked a little pain with his pleasure. The very thought of it made her want to gag. So, instead, she rolled her eyes and sighed in resignation. Fine, one kiss on the cheek, but that's it, and you keep your hands to yourself, got it? Ilof smirked, clenching his fist around her ornament. Got it. Astrid looked up at the cheek he'd presented with a tilt of his head that she was supposed to kiss and shook her head. You have to bend down, Moran. I'm not climbing you like a tree. Aside from looking a little disappointed at that, Ilof did as she asked, planting his hands on either side of her on the boulder she was standing beside. Better. Thor save me from idiots. Yes, she huffed, before rising on her toes and pressing a brief peck to his clean-shaven skin. She should have expected it, knowing the lengths boys, including the one in front of her, had gone to try and steal kisses from her, but she was still surprised when he turned his head and captured her mouth in a slobbery kiss. And then he crowded her up against the rock, pressing his thick form against her and making it clearly obvious that he found her desirable as he rubbed against her suggestively. Astrid was not impressed. She grabbed handfuls of his hair and yanked hard. Ilof moaned greedily, believe it or not, and pressed on, trying to get his tongue in her mouth. Astrid was tempted to let him, just so she could bite it, but she was afraid he'd just like it. So she ran her hands down his chest, which he took as more encouragement by the mumbled, yes, baby, and groped around his belt until she found the eating dagger tucked under it and then proceeded to press it very deliberately against the unwelcome thing poking her in the stomach like a rabid snake through their clothes. Thank Thor for clothes or I'd feel very defiled right now. As is, I feel like I've been humped by a horny yak. The dagger stabbing his sensitive bits fortunately got his attention in a hurry. Ilof quickly backed up, eyes wide as she followed with narrowed eyes, not letting up on the pressure with the knife. If you ever kiss me again without my permission, I will cut this off, do you understand me? She snarled. Yes, he squeaked. Astrid applied just a fraction more pressure to the knife. Good. Now give me my skull. He dropped it into her waiting hand like it was a hot coal. Thank you. Astrid clenched her fist around it and smiled with a vicious baring of teeth. Then she whirled and threw his dagger across the clearing, burying it to the hilt in the center of a target. That's what I'll do to your manhood if I ever hear of you forcing yourself on any other girl, either, got it? Ilof gulped as he gaped at his quivering knife with wide eyes and then nodded frantically. I'm glad we understand each other, she said sweetly as she sauntered away like nothing was amiss, in complete contradiction to her pounding heart and sweat-soaked shirt. For a few seconds, Astrid had genuinely been afraid because he was so much bigger than her and there was no way she could outmuscle him. But she would always be smarter and that was where the boys constantly underestimated her. She also thought she might start carrying another knife hidden up her arm wrap, just in case. With the position Ilof had her in, she hadn't been able to reach the dagger in her boot, and that had worried her until she remembered where he kept his. Thank Thor that's over. And God's willing, one less boy trying to get under my skirt. By the time Astrid made it down to Hiccup's house, she'd more or less put the incident behind her, having wiped her mouth thoroughly in disgust with the back of her arm, and then making a side trip to a stream to rinse her mouth out repeatedly when that hadn't felt like enough. She'd felt contaminated until she'd done so. She still felt kind of contaminated, actually, and needed a good dose of Hiccup's well-mannered intelligence to help her forget how much trouble she might have been in if she wasn't a well-trained warrior girl with more determination than actual strength. If I was one of the barmaids with no training, I wouldn't have stood a chance against him. Not that those hussies would have wanted to say no, but still. Sighing at the unfairness of being a girl less than half the size of an average male Viking, Astrid finally looked at the skull in her hand, instantly spotting where the metal had broken off from where it used to be attached to her belt. At least I know just the right person to get it fixed, she thought with a smile as she knocked on the thick wooden door. Chapter 7, Confessions. Chapter text. Confessions. When he heard the knock on the door, Hiccup had a moment of sheer panic and he froze, unable to think of what to do. If it was Astrid, he wasn't sure if he could bear to see her. If it was a member of their tribe looking for his father, then he really should go answer it. He just didn't want to. The decision was taken from his hands in the next moment. Hiccup. You in here? Astrid's voice came from within the house directly after he heard the door creak open. Oh gods. She came in. Of course she came in. She's Astrid. And I have to say something before this gets awkward. Hiccup was incapable of not answering her, even if there was a little part of him that would rather hide under the bed and pretend that no one was home. He sat up, tossing the pillow back in the general direction of where it belonged. Yeah, I'm upstairs. I'll be down in a sec, he called back, proud of how his voice sounded almost normal, only creaking slightly on the I. "Kay," she called back cheerfully, the door creaking again as she closed it behind her. How can she sound so normal? Shouldn't she sound guilty? No. Of course not. She has nothing to be guilty about. She's not actually betraying me or anything. At least, as far as she's concerned. Thor, kill me. I don't want to go down there. But I have to. Or she'll come up here, and that's even worse because there's my bed. And I've imagined way too many things about her and I together in this bed. Gods, I'm pathetic, and maybe a bit disgusting. Hiccup scrubbed his hands over his face and then through his hair, making it stick up, before he realized what he'd done and made a sad attempt at patting it back down. Giving up after a few seconds, he stood. You can do this, he muttered to himself under his breath, needing the pep talk. It's just Astrid. Just Astrid. Ha. More like just the most beautiful, kick-ass girl ever. Who just happened to be locking lips with a guy worthy of being called a Viking not so many minutes ago. What is she doing here already, anyhow? Shouldn't she still be snogging the appropriately named Ilof the Lucky? Just before Astrid had showed up, Hiccup had come to the conclusion that she had told her mother she was coming to his house as a cover to go hang out with her secret boyfriend. Was I wrong about that? The young Viking male was certainly confused as he slowly trudged down the stairs. And she's gone. He thought with confusion tinged with just a hint of relief as he gazed around the open concept living space. I didn't take that long to come down, did I? No, I didn't. And I didn't hear the door open again. She must be around here somewhere. Astrid most definitely wasn't in the sitting area or the kitchen. He didn't even bother looking for her in his father's room, knowing she wouldn't dare go in there. Which left only one place. He found her rummaging in the cold storage room under the house, the open door in the floor under his stairs a dead giveaway once he'd walked far enough around the stairs to see it. Hiccup climbed down the ladder and found himself the recipient of a gorgeous beaming smile, her white, even teeth gleaming in the light of the lantern hanging from a hook on the wall. His poor, bewildered heart skipped a couple of beats and he grinned back out of habit. Hiccup, Astrid gushed, happy to see him, looking rumpled and adorable, as usual. Her heart tripped happily in her chest and all she wanted to do was throw her arms around him and demand that he help her forget that the last half hour had ever happened. Instead, she continued to play it cool as if her world was just as relatively normal as it had been yesterday and that she was perfectly fine with being just the best friend of one Hiccup Horrendous Haddock III. I saw that you hadn't started anything for dinner yet, so I thought I would make us some sandwiches. That sounds great, Hiccup said automatically, wrapping his arms around the heavy wheel of yak milk cheese she pushed against his chest. Okay. I'm doing this. It's just another day and we're still the friends we've always been. This isn't so bad. They climbed up the ladder and gathered the sandwich makings onto the table. Between the two of them, a loaf of bread, a wedge of cheese, and strips of cured yak meat quickly turned into a platter of sandwiches. Hiccup served them a mug of mead each from the barrel and they sat down across from each other to eat. As usual, Hiccup ate like he was starving, and Astrid was only slightly more dignified. A long day of work or training, plus growing teenage bodies would do that to a person. They were too busy inhaling their meal to talk much, but the silence was comfortable after so many years together. When the last crumb of bread had been picked up from the platter and the last dredge of mead drunk from his mug, Hiccup sat back in his chair with a contented sigh. That was good. Astrid put her mug down and wiped her mouth with her arm. She leaned against the wooden slats of her chair as well and belched softly before giggling. Yep. My stomach agrees. She gave Hiccup an inquisitive look. So? What did you do today? Hiccup shrugged, slumping down further. Nothing much. Same old really. Ate breakfast. Went to work. Banged on some metal. Delivered some metal. Banged on some more metal. Had lunch. Repeat morning. Finished the new dagger I made you from some scraps. Came home. Sketched. Had an uncomfortable talk with my dad. He didn't at the part where he found her making out with Ilof, not even wanting to go there. Instead, he raised a brow. And you? Astrid waved a hand. Same old for me, too, for the most part. Did you say you made me a new dagger? She leaned forward eagerly, hoping she'd heard him right. Hiccup grinned. I did. Astrid jumped up from her chair and rushed around to his side of the table, hugging him around the shoulders briefly. Thank you. Hiccup nearly died from the bliss of having her arms wrapped around him, her enticing girl scent wafting over him, and her breasts pressed to his arm, even if it was just for 2 seconds. Thank you, Thor. As she straightened up, she said, Where is it? Hiccup chuckled at her impatience. On my desk. I'll get it for you, he was going to say, but she was already gone, flying up the stairs 2 at a time. Always so impulsive. He shook his head in amusement and rose to his feet. Seeing the wheel of cheese, he grabbed it and took it back down to the cold storage room. From there, he climbed back up the ladder, closed the door in the floor, and then went outside to get some more wood for the fire while there was still a little daylight left to see by. Astrid skidded to a stop in front of Hiccup's desk, eagerly snatching up the small dagger that sat on the right side of the desk, catching the last rays of the setting sun with a merry glimmer. She admired the little dagger that was more ornament than anything, turning it this way and that to see it at every possible angle. The double-sided blade was no longer than her fingers, but sharpened to a deadly point with edges to match, and had a beautifully sculpted crossguard. It had a yak horn hilt, polished to a high gleam. She knew from experience that would have taken hours to do. And the best part, in her opinion, was the carving of a skull he'd put on the top of the hilt, to match her belt and shoulder guard skulls. This wasn't a simple afternoon side project like he'd made it sound. Hiccup had probably spent days on this. Gods, I love him. It's not even my birthday or Snoggletog. And it was the perfect size to hide in her arm wrapping. It's like it was meant to be, she thought as she did exactly that. Astrid glanced out Hiccup's window, smiling when she saw him carrying a load of wood that literally obscured his ability to see where he was going. She was about to run down the stairs to get the door for him when her gaze caught the corner of a paper sticking out from under a pile of other sketches. Curious at what looked like a foot, since she didn't know Hiccup drew anything but fanciful inventions, Astrid slid the other papers to the side and gasped in surprise because it was a drawing of her. A very good drawing, in fact, of her and Ruffnut sparring with swords, frowns of concentration on their faces as they stared each other down in mock battle. Would you look at that? He's surprised me yet again. Astrid was seriously impressed with Hiccup's skill at capturing the moment. The shading, the impression of movement, the accuracy of their features, it was all worthy of an artisan. He might not ever be the world's best warrior, but he had so many other things going for him that it didn't matter. Besides, she was more than capable of defending herself, so it's not like she needed a giant of a man to protect her. Is there more? Now really curious, Astrid started flipping through the stack of sketches and found drawing after drawing of her or her with someone else, sparring in some fashion or another. That made her smile, because Hiccup had definitely captured what she was most passionate about. And then she found a drawing of herself wearing nothing but her hair. How dare he? Was her first thought as she gasped in outrage. But that faded as she realized that you couldn't actually see anything indecent in the sketch. The more she studied it, the more she realized it had been drawn with loving detail, from her dreamy expression where her chin rested on her folded arms, to each strand of hair, to the blades of grass that she was lying on, to the way her toes curled as she waved her feet in the air. This picture wasn't meant to be lewd, it was a work of art. Astrid actually remembered the day he probably drew this, but she'd been fully clothed at the time. It was about a month ago, in the peak of summer, and they'd spent an afternoon picking berries. Before going home with their baskets of delicious loot, they'd spent a few minutes lying in the grass, looking out over the ocean. Astrid remembered wondering out loud what the rest of the world looked like and if she'd ever get to see it, having never left the island except for that one time to visit her grandparents on a neighboring island a couple hours voyage away. As she stared at the picture, Astrid had a revelation. Oh my gods! Hiccup likes me. As a girl. He wouldn't be drawing so many pictures of me if he didn't. And he most certainly wouldn't be drawing naked pictures if he didn't. Holy Thor! A flush of pleasure swept over her from head to toe and she nearly squealed with happiness. Now all I have to do was get him to confess. Or maybe I should just tackle him to the floor and kiss him. Choices, choices. A crash of wood and a colorful curse detailing Odin's ugly little toe coming from downstairs startled her out of her contemplation. Astrid quickly returned the sketches to a fairly accurate approximation of the way she'd found them and then dashed across the loft and down the stairs. She found Hiccup kicking a chunk of wood into submission, apparently after it had rolled off his neat stack of logs and landed on his toe, if his mutters were anything to go by. The log was sent sailing into the fireplace in the center of the living space with a triumphant, "You can burn first, you cursed thing." "You tell that log," Hiccup, Astrid said on a laugh, crossing her arms over her chest. "I'm sure it will be properly repentant when it's nothing more than ash." "Exactly what I thought," Hiccup said with a twitching snarl, amusement starting to replace anger, but not taking his eyes off the offending log until it had caught fire with belated enthusiasm. Sighing, Hiccup backed up to sit on the stone bench that lined one wall and pulled his boot off to rub at his sore toe through his wool sock. Quashing the ridiculous urge to offer to kiss it all better, Astrid walked over and sat beside him, just close enough so that their shoulders and thighs brushed. "Now, how do I bring up the subject of our feelings?" With no real idea yet, she started with something safe. "Thank you for the dagger, Hiccup. It's beautiful, and exactly what I need." Hiccup looked over at her in surprise, forgetting about his throbbing toe. "It is. It's not very big. I thought it might make a nice eating dagger, at best." Astrid quickly shook her head. "No, it's perfect." She pulled it partway out of her arm wrapping in demonstration. "Look, hidden dagger for emergencies." Hiccup shot her a look of happy enlightenment. "It is perfect. I never thought of that." "Well, I did. I was wishing I had one just an hour ago, in fact." Now Hiccup was feeling a great deal of concern. "Why, what happened? And don't you have another in your boot?" "I do, but there are occasions where I can't reach my boot," she said as she dug into the pouch on her belt and pulled out the silver skull, dropping it into Hiccup's hand as he looked at it in surprise. "So I lost this today, and I went back up to the clearing to find it. Ilof volunteered himself to help me look, and since I couldn't bear to lose it, I agreed." Her voice was serious and quiet as she stared at the fire, not really wanting to look at him as she told her story. Hiccup was starting to get a sense of dawning horror as he put puzzle pieces together, and he didn't like the picture he was coming up with. Astrid's next words confirmed his suspicions, making him feel like an utter idiot. And like murder might be something he was capable of. He found the skull, of course, and demanded a reward before he would give it back. I agreed to give him a kiss on the cheek, and that was all. He took advantage and squashed me up against a boulder while making a solid attempt at slobbering all over my face. Astrid glanced at Hiccup, biting her lip as she wondered how he was taking this. The look of outrage building in his expression on her behalf was gratifying to see. Hiccup was wishing he was 5 times bigger and could call out Ilof and beat him to a pulp for daring to touch Astrid without her permission. I couldn't budge him off of me, the giant oaf, so I grabbed his dagger from his belt and basically stabbed his manhood right through his tunic and trousers. That got his attention mighty quick. "Holy shit!" Hiccup yelped, eyes wide as he suppressed the urge to cover his own pride and joy out of sheer male instinct. "I bet it did." Astrid grinned. "I also threatened to use his dangly bits as a target if I ever heard of him forcing himself on other girls." Hiccup burst out laughing. "Oh, Thor, I wish I'd seen that. That would have made my year." Astrid's smile turned sly as she finally figured out what to do about Hiccup. "I know something that will make your year even better." Now he gave her a puzzled look, raising one eyebrow. "What's that?" "'Cause I honestly don't know if you can top the mental image I have of Ilof getting put down like that." Ilof had a habit of shoving Hiccup anytime he happened to pass him and calling him rabbit fart or something equally as dreadful. I was thinking I'd like to kiss someone of my own volition for once, Astrid said softly, leaning closer to Hiccup and giving him her best doe eyes and pretending she wasn't totally quaking on the inside from fear of rejection. Hiccup gulped, breaking out in a sweat as all of his fantasies seemed to be coming to life. Best to make sure, though. Are you saying you'd like to kiss me? He finally managed to get out past the lump in his throat. Yes, you idiot. Get with the program. Astrid bit her lip again for an entirely different reason as she nodded and leaned even closer to him. Oh, Thor, her prey squeaked out just before Astrid pressed her mouth to his in a 2-second peck before pulling back. The blonde warrior girl studied Hiccup's expression, hoping she hadn't mistaken what the drawings meant.